This oil rig has a dark secret. I just finished training for oil rig work. My mom thought I was nuts. But honestly, I was excited. Adventure had a new name and it was called the Kraken. Yeah, that was the actual name of the rig. The helicopter was headed straight for the middle of nowhere. I couldn't help but stick my face against the window. I felt like a kid on his way to Disneyland. Except instead of roller coasters and Mickey Mouse, I was headed to the Gulf of Mexico and getting a huge paycheck out of it. As we started our descent, the rig came into view. It looked like a giant metal monster in the middle of the ocean. It was one of the oldest in the Gulf. The pay was unbelievable, and the recruiter said something about a special bonus if I finished my contract. I signed up as soon as I got my certifications. The moment my boots hit the deck of the Kraken, I was hit with the smell of salty air and oil. The noise was louder than I expected. There was a constant hum of machinery that made the ground vibrate. A couple of guys in different colored vests waited for us. I was told to go to the guy in orange. He looked like he'd been out here for months. He had rough, leathery skin and a slight limp. "What's your name, son?" he asked over the noise. "You can call me Sully, sir. I'm the new welder," I said. "Sully, huh? Well, welcome to the Kraken. I'm Gene, the head welder around here. Now, first rule of survival. Always wear this." He handed me a silver pin. Engraved on it was a sea monster attacking a whale. "Put it on. Keep it on you at all times. In the shower, in bed, it doesn't matter, okay? Just make sure you have it," Gene insisted, fixing me with a stare that said, "Don't ask stupid questions." I clipped the pin to my shirt, noticing for the first time that everyone around me wore the same thing. Gene started walking and I followed, trying to take it all in. The rig was a damn maze. I'd never seen anything so big in my entire life. "So here's the deal. This place is more than nuts and bolts," he began. "There are rules that aren't in the manual, but it's important you follow them if you want to survive the job. So, you remember what rule number 1 is?" Gene raised an eyebrow at me. "Yeah, always wear the pin," I said. The old man nodded with approval. "That's right, rookie. It lets them know you're part of the crew. They can't take you before your time." As we walked, Gene kept the tour going, pointing out parts of the rig I remembered from the safety videos. "Yeah, and over here is the rec center. This is where you spend most of your downtime." We entered through the double doors into a surprisingly cozy area. There was a gym and a snack counter. Next to it was a small library filled with books and board games. Gene opened another door to a room with a few sofas and a large TV. And yes, a ping pong table. "So here's the lounge. We got decent internet too. It's all about keeping sane out here. Being cooped up for weeks, it can mess with your head if you're not very careful," he said. It made sense. You see, people couldn't just leave the rig when the weekend rolled around. The deal was, I'd be on the Kraken for a whole month. After that, they'd fly us back to shore for 3 weeks of vacation. Then it was back to the Kraken until the contract ended. So it was nice to know there were plenty of ways to unwind here. Finally, Gene showed me to the dorm room. It was basic. Bunk bed, a small desk, and a locker for personal items. My roommate was a guy named Clive. He was the only other welder on the rig. But we wouldn't be seeing each other much. With only 2 welders on board, someone always had to be on duty. so we worked around each other's shifts. Before entering the room, I noticed a red metal door at the end of the hall. Jean grabbed me by the arm and pointed at the door. "That's the second rule here, Sully. That door. You never open it, you got that? No matter what you hear." "What's behind it?" I asked. "Restricted area. You don't want to end up like Joe," he said. Jean told me the whole story. It was just before his time at the Kraken. Joe was an odd guy, mostly kept to himself, but he was damn good with the machines. Always had his wrench at the ready. But one day, things got weird for him. He just started packing up all of a sudden. Boots, clothes, even snagged his pillow off his bunk. Everyone was scratching their heads because his leave wasn't due for another week. His friends asked him about it, but the only thing Joe said was that he needed to go home. So they thought it was a family emergency. But instead of heading up to the chopper pad, he walked straight to the red door with all his stuff. Nobody followed him, of course. Even back then, everyone knew the rule about the red door. But management lost their heads. They said anyone who even touched the door would lose their job. And then a day later, oil started leaking out from under it. Lots of it. It came out as a trickle at first. The techs thought there was a system leak. The last thing you want on a rig is an oil spill. But the operators, they just waved it off and told everyone to ignore it. But it kept coming. Soon enough, petroleum filled the hallway. Jean said it got up to an inch deep. Took 3 days before it stopped. And it took the cleanup crew a whole week to mop it up. But the smell lingered for months. Joe's family was told that he fell off the rig and drowned. But one of the cleanup guys found something in the mess. It was Joe's wedding ring, right in the middle of the oil spill. It was pretty clear what I was supposed to get from that story. Rule number 2, don't enter the red door. After dinner, I decided to get some fresh air and headed to the upper deck. The rig operated 24/7. It was still noisy at night. But beyond the Kraken, the Gulf was pretty peaceful. It was miles and miles of endless ocean. As I looked out over the water, something caught my eye. It was too dark to make out clearly at first. Whatever it was, it blocked out the stars. I moved closer to the edge to get a better look. A massive shape moved in the distance. It rose up, and I realized what it was. A tidal wave. It was forming not far from us. The wave grew taller until it was as high as the deck I was standing on. I couldn't say how quickly it was moving, but I knew those things traveled very fast. I turned to run, and I slammed right into Jean. "Whoa, what's got you running like a scared cat?" he asked. It's a tsunami or something. It's huge. Look, it's gonna hit the rig," I replied. "Hey, relax, son. We don't get tsunamis here in the Gulf. Not like that, anyway," Jean said, not bothering to look at all. Instead, he put a calming hand on my shoulder. "But look at it," I insisted. Jean paused, then asked, "Did you look east after sunset?" I don't know, I'm not maybe," I said. "That's the third rule, Sully. Never look directly into the eastern sea after sunset. You can't trust anything you see out there," he replied. What the hell was he talking about? How could we just ignore a massive wave coming right at us? I tried to shove him towards the railing so he could see for himself. But he was stronger than he looked. He didn't even budge. Instead, he steered me around until I was facing away from the swell. "Son, look. The ocean screws with a man's head," he began. "You're gonna see a lot of things out here you won't understand. That's why we got these rules. You'll learn each of them when the time comes. So if you see anything off, you come to me first, you got that?" But I couldn't let it go. "Look, I know what I saw. We're gonna risk everyone's lives over a bunch of superstitions." Gene remained calm, but there was an edge to his voice now. "If that wave was real, don't you think we'd all be drinking seawater by now?" I froze. He was right. Gene led me back down to my room. He told me I had an early start tomorrow and to get some rest. I just nodded and began kicking off my shoes. But just before he left, he made me say the third rule. Rule number 3, never look at the Eastern Ocean after sunset. My alarm rang, marking the start of my first official day on the Kraken. Rolling out of bed, I noticed Clive was knocked down on his booth, exhausted from his own shift. After getting ready, I headed to the mess hall where I grabbed a quick breakfast. The day ahead was going to be a full one. Gene handed me my schedule after I ate. As a rig crew, we were on for 12-hour shifts, but thankfully, they fed us 4 times a day and we got plenty of breaks. Being the new guy, my job for the day was to shadow Gene. This meant I'd get a first-hand look at what it took to keep the Kraken running. Our work as welders was crucial out here. Sea air corroded metal very fast. My first task was to help Gene replace a section of railing that had rusted through. And as I cut it away, I could see how much the salt had eaten into it. We measured and cut a new piece. Then I followed Gene's lead, fixing the new metal into place with clean welds. As the day went on, we moved from one job to another. I got a real education in just how much work it took to keep everything together. We spent most of our time fixing leaky pipes and replacing rusty bolts. By the afternoon, I was getting the hang of things. That was when Gene said we needed to go to the drilling floor for urgent maintenance. As we made our way there, he dropped another one of his rules. Rule number 4, don't speak unless spoken to when near the drill, he said. Gene led me down to the drilling floor, a whole different world from the rest of the rig. It was hot and cramped down here. The entire crew was covered in grease. As I followed Gene, I noticed everyone was using hand signals to communicate. Made total sense, considering how loud the machines were. But they kept silent, even when they were standing next to each other, only using hand signs. I guess down here, they took that rule seriously. We kept moving deeper into the rig, and the deeper we went, the smell of petroleum and seawater got stronger. There was a constant rushing sound around me, like being next to a fast-flowing river. The walls vibrated with the force of the machinery and the ocean around us. Finally, we arrived at a section where the pipes on the wall were shaking. They looked like they could fall off at any moment. Gene pointed them out and gestured to his kit. I got the picture. We got straight to work. I grabbed the welding gear while Gene held the new mounts in place. Working here wasn't just about sticking pieces together. It was about making sure everything stayed where it should. The job took all my concentration as I tried to make the welds as strong as possible. In this part of the rig, a bad weld didn't just mean a repair job. It could mean disaster. As we worked, I heard a sudden groaning noise. The whole space tilted to one side. I lost my footing, and my head banged against the pipe. Damn it, what the hell was that? I cursed. Gene quickly gestured at me to keep quiet, his eyes wide and serious. But before I could respond, a deep moaning sound echoed around us again. It was louder this time. It vibrated through my chest. It came in waves that got louder and then softer, almost like a whale song. But it felt like it came from something much bigger. I was suddenly aware of how small I was, and how easy it would be to get crushed by the steel above me, or how easy it would be for the ocean to just knock us down. We shouldn't be here, I thought. Some deep part of my mind was screaming at me to get out of here because something big was coming. It felt like my head was splitting open. Gene ripped off his helmet and put a hand over my mouth. I noticed blood trickling from his nose. The terrible noise continued as he kept his hand firmly over my mouth. I did my best to stay calm. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but eventually the noise faded away. The rig steadied, and I could hear the familiar sounds of machinery again. Gene removed his hand before wiping his nose with a sleeve. He put a finger to his lips to remind me to stay quiet. Then, when he was sure that I was okay, he went back to welding like nothing happened. I followed his lead. I could still feel my head throb. I was sure this was going to give me a migraine. After we finished the job, we packed up our gear and walked out of the lower decks. I felt the crew's eyes on me when we passed by. Once we reached the surface, I couldn't hold my questions any longer. Okay, Gene, what the hell just happened down there? I asked. That's why there's a rule about talking near the drill, he began. The closer you are to the drill, the more it can hear you. It. Oh, okay, what is it? I asked. Gene shrugged. He looked tired. Look, that's what I was told when I started here. I don't have all the answers, Sully. This rig, it's different. You've got to respect the rules if you want to stay safe. Okay, and are there other rules I should know about? I said. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. There are 3 more rules you need to remember. Rule number 5, no red meat on Wednesdays. Rule number 6, do not ignore the bell when it rings 3 times. Then, Gene looked around to see if anyone was near. He looked scared. This last one, it's the most important rule of all. But you're not supposed to know about it this early. But trust me, it's for everyone's sake. I'll tell you when it's time, he said. Alright, come on, Gene, cut the bullshit, okay? If it's so important, why keep it a damn secret? How am I gonna keep people safe if I don't even know how to do that? I said. Gene looked exhausted, like all the years on the rig were finally getting to him. Look, son, please just trust me on this, alright? I've kept you alive this long. Just remember those 6 rules, and I'll tell you the last one when you need to hear it, okay? The rest of the shift passed by without anything else happening. Gene was all about business after our talk. His calm attitude helped me get back into the routine of the work. I started to relax, forgetting about what happened in the lower decks. As the days passed, life on the rig fell into a predictable pattern. Wednesday came around, and like he said, we didn't get any red meat that day. I heard a few grumbles from the crew about not getting bacon for breakfast, but it seemed like everyone knew this was coming. I didn't mind. The chicken fajitas I ate were the best I'd ever had. But I did see something that day. I was getting a second helping of beans when I saw the cooks filling up an oil drum with meat, chops, sausages, even a whole leg of lamb. They threw them in straight from the freezer. A steward checked off a list every time they put something in. But that drum wasn't just full of meat. Every time they threw something in, I could see crude oil splash against the rim. When it was full, they wheeled the drum out of the kitchen. I had no idea where they were headed. Gene saw me looking at the whole process. All he could do was shrug and say, "That's Wednesdays for you." Other than that, the week went by peacefully. We went around the rig, replacing anything too rusty to be useful, or doing minor maintenance when we weren't busy. Sometimes, I'd get time in the afternoon to play a game of pool. But at night, I'd see things from the corner of my eye when I was on the upper deck. If it was from the east, I ignored it. Sometimes, there'd be lights on the water, bright yellows and greens. Other times, there'd be a thick fog. One time, I swore something huge flew past the rig. It was a massive shape passing behind us. But overall, I was getting used to being on the Kraken. I did finally meet Clive at some point. He was a funny guy when he wasn't snoring into a pillow. He told me his contract had been renewed 6 times so far. He had 2 kids he was putting through college back in Louisiana. And that was something I noticed a lot too. The crew would often talk about how many contract renewals they'd signed up for. But it was like there was an unspoken hierarchy about that. The more times someone had signed up again, the more respect people seemed to give them. Didn't matter what rank they were. I'd seen guys get into arguments against their supervisors. And you know what the crazy thing was? I'd seen drilling heads back down when renewals got brought up. Other than that, the crew got along really well. Before I knew it, I was a couple of days away from going on leave. But something happened that made me question whether I'd even want to go back to the Kraken. It was a Tuesday. Me and Gene were back below deck. We were fixing up railings on the walkways. I'd gotten used to the occasional groan or tilting under there. Just as we were about to finish up, a bell rang over the PA system. 3 loud clangs, one after the other. Gene paused and looked at me. "You remember what that means, right?" I knew we weren't supposed to ignore the bell, but I was fuzzy on the details. "Yeah, we shouldn't ignore the bell, but what exactly are we supposed to do?" I replied. "Leave your gear, follow me to the safe rooms," he said as he took off his helmet. Safe rooms? I couldn't remember anything about safe rooms during training. Still, I followed Gene's lead. We made our way back to the upper decks. Other crew joined us, all headed the same way. The safe rooms turned out to be 3 large rooms on the rig. Each one was equipped with a small medic station and bathrooms. Gene led me into one of them. Looking around, I noticed some guys who looked like they'd just woken up. Clive was one of them. His hair was a mess, and he was standing around in his boxers. And yet, he was still wearing his silver pin. Once everyone was inside, the bell rang out 3 more times. Then, a couple of operators slid the door shut. My eyes were drawn to the inside of the door as it closed. It was covered in writing, though it wasn't any language I recognized. They looked Egyptian to me because of these little drawings. There was a drawing of a fish with big eyes, a circle with tentacles coming out of it, a snake with 2 heads, and a bunch of other characters made up of dots and sharp lines. Jean wandered over to one of the chairs lining the back wall and sat down. Everyone around me started making themselves comfortable. Seemed like we'd be here a while. I saw Clive sit in a corner and nod off. And then there was a knock on the door. Everyone froze, like they were very scared of what would happen next. I looked over at Clive. He was wide awake now, his face going pale. The knocking continued. Then a voice started shouting to let him in. The operators were huddled by the door. It was clear they were arguing with each other, but I couldn't really hear what they were saying. All around me, people were getting into their own debates. Tensions were rising. I looked back at Gene, but his eyes were fixed firmly at the door, his fingers rubbing at the pin on his shirt. The man outside continued to yell. He begged us to let him in. He said it wasn't fair that he got locked out. He was asleep when the bells rang, and his dorm was the farthest away from the safe rooms. The operators seemed to come to a decision. 2 of them opened the doors just a crack, but it wasn't big enough to let the guy through. A couple of the guys behind me started shouting. They said not to risk everyone's lives. Some of them yelled about how the rules needed to be followed. The senior operator walked up to the opening and whispered something. Hobbs, I think his name was. Shouting broke out. The man outside started shoving his fingers through the door. He was trying to force himself through. I could hear Hobbs now. You get back or we'll crush those fingers, Barker. You know the rules. We can't let you in. Barker, the man behind the door, started pleading, saying he renewed 10 times, that he was almost done paying for his wife's medical bills. Then you shouldn't have left your damn pin. Barricade your dorm. Maybe you'll survive, all right? Hobbs said back. And then I saw something that still haunts me to this day. The senior operator grabbed his radio and he slammed it on Barker's fingers. I heard something snap. Barker howled like a dog as he pulled away. And just like that, they shut the doors on him. Silence fell over the crowd, and then the rig pitched to one side. I could feel the floor vibrate before I heard a loud noise from below. Everyone get down. You know what to do, Hobbs said. People fell on their knees, trying not to fall on one another as they sat down. I followed their lead, and I waited for it to be over. But behind the door, Barker started screaming. The rig was tilting side to side now. It was like we were in a hurricane. All around me, people were rubbing their silver pins. Their eyes were wide with fear. Then, another groan came from below, but this one sounded more like a howl. It completely covered up Barker's yelling. The vibrations bounced around my chest and worked their way up to my fillings. Someone gagged behind me. I could feel the nausea building up too. This was just like that first day, when Jean warned me about talking in the lower decks. I looked up, and the writings on the door looked like they were moving. The fish with 2 eyes blinked at me. The 2-headed snake wrapped around a drawing of a human. The thing with the tentacles spun around like a whirlwind. Human figures danced in a chain. And then suddenly, it all stopped. The Kraken stopped rocking. The painful groaning disappeared. The writing on the door was the same as before. For a few moments, no one said anything. Then the bells rang out on the PA system again. The guys at the front started opening the doors, but no one else moved. Hobbs walked out and immediately ran back in. "You all stay in your dorms until further notice," he told us. I wasn't going to argue, but as I got to the doors, I could see why he said that. There wasn't much of Barker left outside the safe room. I saw his shoe caught in some pipes on the ceiling. I tried to avoid stepping on anything red, but there were chunks scattered all over the hallway, and mixed in with the gore was shimmering black oil. I went on my assigned leave a few days after that. I didn't really have anywhere to go. I just bummed around Cancun till it was time for me to go back. Now, I did think about quitting, but I really should have read the fine print on that contract before I signed. Turns out, I was under bond, which meant that if I quit early, I'd have to pay up 3 months' worth of my salary, plus a bunch of other penalties. I didn't have that kind of money, and I was still paying for the loans I had to take out to get certified for this job. People like to say that we always have a choice. What no one ever tells you, though, is that a lot of times you get screwed no matter what you pick. Soon enough, I was back on the copter on my way to the Kraken. The atmosphere was a lot more tense than when I started a few months ago. People really didn't joke around as much anymore, or even talk to one another during breaks. And I'm not the type to rat somebody out, but a lot of empty tequila bottles started popping up in the rec areas. At the end of my first week back, Gene brought out his own and poured me a shot. "You still remember all those rules, Sully? The ones not in the manuals?" he slurred out. I turned down the drink, but I nodded. I could never forget them. "Well, here's the thing. Now's the time to tell you about that last one. The most important one." Gene leaned over, and he lowered his voice. So rule number 7. Everyone joins the raffle," he whispered. I had wondered for weeks what the big secret rule was. That was the last thing I expected. A raffle. Okay, what does that mean? I asked. But Gene looked like he was about to pass out. "Oh, it's a big thing. Lots of money going round. But remember, my boy, you gotta be there," he said, as he pushed himself off me, and he wandered off to bed. He wouldn't tell me anything else about the raffle after that. All he said was that it's something the company does at the end of everyone's 3-month contract. I pretty much kept my head down for the next couple weeks. I did my job, had my pin on me all the time, and I stayed out of people's way. Things were getting a lot more hostile among the crew. I heard a lot more arguments break out. I never actually saw a fight, but I've seen some people walking around with cuts and bruises. And then finally, it was time for the raffle. It was everyone's last day on the job, unless someone agreed to renew, of course. I looked over my shift schedule that day, and I saw the entire evening was blocked out for the raffle. Everyone was supposed to gather at the main deck after the last dinner shift. The cooks went all out that night. Steak and lobster for everyone. But no one seemed hungry. I finished up my food and I hung around the rec center until it was time to go up. At around 9 p.m., The PA system told everyone to go to the main deck. When I got there, the crowd was forming a rough circle around Hobbs and the other senior managers. They were setting up a bingo cage and some speakers. Behind them was a large oil drum. I found Gene in the crowd, and I got up next to him. Everyone looked nervous and twitchy. Then Hobbs picked up a mic and addressed the crowd. "Evening, everyone. Good job on getting to the end of your contracts. Now, before we do the raffle, I want to clarify something. What happened to Ron Barker was tragic, but it did not count. We made a deal to keep the oil flowing, to keep the Kraken floating, to keep the money coming. We follow the rules, and we do the raffle every 3 months. Now, Mr. Barker, he broke the rules, and we still have to do this." Hobbs cleared his throat and continued. The good news, though, is that the company will be doing a 10% increase on this round's bonuses. Just this once. Everyone who doesn't win the raffle will get the usual bonus plus the increase on top. Sound good? That did sound good to me. I'd forgotten about that end of contract bonus. I remember reading something about that in the paperwork, but no one else seemed as excited about it as I was. The only reaction Hobbs got was a couple of weak cheers. He didn't really care, though. He signaled to the guy mixing up the bingo cage. He gave it a few more turns, then took out a wooden ball. Without looking at it, he handed the ball to Hobbs. "The winner of this round's raffle is Mr. Clive Harper," Hobbs said. A loud cry erupted to my right. There was a scuffle and some shouting, until finally, Clive was brought to the middle. 2 big men held him down. Gene's hand clamped on my arm. He leaned down and whispered in my ear, "It'll be over soon, all right? Just think of that bonus. Think of all the good it'll do for your family. That's why most of us are here now," he said, and it sounded like he was pleading with me. One of the managers opened up the oil drum behind Hobbs. She dipped a large cup in it and walked over to where Clive was kneeling. He was crying and begging now. A man grabbed him by the hair and forced his head back. And then she poured thick black oil down Clive's throat. She didn't stop until the cup was empty. I could hear Clive gagging until he threw up the oil. And as soon as he did, the other managers ran up and they dipped paintbrushes into the mess. Then they ran off to the edge of the rig and they started painting. They drew symbols on the floor going around the perimeter of the Kraken, symbols like the ones I saw in the safe room. Every now and then, they'd go back and dip their paintbrush in the stuff Clive threw up. The crowd was silent. No one moved, except to let the managers pass through. The only thing I could hear was Clive gagging. "Gene, what the hell is going on? What is this?" I demanded. Gene looked at me. "Someone has to do it, kid. That's part of the deal the company made with whatever's keeping the well full. But the bosses, they give everyone a bonus for having to go through this. Some of these guys, they've been renewing their contracts for years without getting chosen. It's all down to luck in the end," he explained. "But Clive, the medics are going to save him, right? He got it all out," I said. Jean's eyes glazed over. Kid. Once the managers finish painting all around the rig, move to the back of the crowd, you hear me? You don't have to do this next part, but you need to stay inside the drawings for the whole thing, he said. The crowd tensed up then. It was like they were all getting ready for something. And then I saw the managers stop painting. Jean pushed me to the back as the crowd surged. Everyone ran towards Clive. Their hands reached out for him. I heard Clive scream for hours.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video. Special thanks to all my patrons. If you'd like to become a supporter and get the audiobook early access version of upcoming stories, there's a link to my Patreon below. Thanks for watching, and have a good night.
My name is Jason Miller, and I work night search and rescue out of the Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station in Yellowstone National Park. If you've ever driven through the north side of the park, you've probably passed our station without noticing it. It sits just off US Route 191, a few miles south of Gardner, tucked behind a gravel parking lot and a maintenance garage the size of a small warehouse. During the day, the place is busy. Rangers move in and out of the building, tourists stop to ask for maps, and parked trucks roll through the lot with coolers, radio gear, and toolboxes rattling in the back. At night, it's different. Most of the lights stay off, the front doors lock, and the only people still working are the rangers on the night rotation. That's where I come in. The night shift covers everything that happens in the park after most visitors have gone to sleep. Car accidents on Highway 89, injured hikers who stayed on the trail too long, campers who wander away from their sites after a few drinks and can't find their way back in the dark. A lot of the calls start the same way. Someone reports a missing person, or a vehicle sitting on the side of the road with the driver gone. Sometimes it's nothing. Someone takes a wrong turn, realizes their mistake, and walks back to the campground before we even get there. Other times, it's not nothing. Most nights, I work with one other ranger and a radio dispatcher inside the station. The trucks stay fueled and parked in a row beside the garage doors so we can get moving quickly. Each truck carries the same gear: trauma kits, rope bags, extra radios, thermal blankets, and floodlights that can turn a dark patch of forest into something that looks like a football stadium. When a call comes in, we grab the closest truck and we drive. If you've never been in Yellowstone after midnight, it's hard to explain how quiet the park gets. The main roads empty out. The campgrounds go dark, one by one. Even the animals seem to disappear for a while. The only sounds left are wind moving through the trees and the engine of the truck rolling along the road. That quiet is why the night shift exists. People underestimate how big Yellowstone really is. The park spreads across 3 states and more than 2 million acres of mountains, forest, rivers, and open valleys. Once the sun goes down, it becomes very easy for someone to step off a trail and disappear into that much wilderness. The official training manuals cover most of what we deal with: wildlife encounters, hypothermia, river crossings, how to organize a search grid when someone goes missing in rough terrain. I read all those manuals during my first week on the job. But there's another set of rules the manuals don't mention. I learned about those during my first night shift. The ranger who trained me was a guy named Kevin Derby. Kevin ran night operations out of the Tower Roosevelt Station and had been doing it longer than anybody else on the roster. On my first night, he walked me through the truck, showed me where the rescue gear was stored, and made sure I knew how to operate the radio system. After that, he handed me a cup of coffee and sat down across the table in the break room. "Before we start the shift," Kevin said, There are a few things you should know. I assumed he meant the usual training stuff. Maybe certain trails where people got lost more often, or roads where tourists like to drive too fast at night. Instead, he gave me 6 rules. None of them were written down, none of them appeared in the training manuals, and every single one of them sounded ridiculous. One rule said if you saw a bear with glowing eyes, you were supposed to stay perfectly still. Another rule involved carrying green Tic Tacs during missing child searches. There was one about staircases in the woods that didn't make any sense at all. I remember laughing when he finished. Kevin didn't laugh. "Listen," he said. "You don't have to believe any of this. I didn't when I started either. But these rules exist because someone broke them once." He took a sip of coffee and looked out the window toward the dark trees behind the station. "Some of those people, they didn't come back." I didn't know Kevin well enough at the time to tell if he was joking or trying to scare the new guy. Most ranger stations have their share of stories, and Yellowstone is full of old ones. People disappear in big wilderness areas sometimes. Happens in every national park. But Kevin didn't tell those rules like a ghost story. He told them like procedures. 3 years later, I worked the same night shift he trained me on. I've responded to enough calls along the roads and trails north of Tower Junction to know how quickly a normal search can turn into something else. I've seen enough strange things in the woods to stop laughing when someone mentions the rules. If you ever work nights out here, you'll hear them eventually. And if you're smart, you'll follow them. The first one is about bears. Rule 1. If you see a bear with glowing eyes, stay perfectly still. It can't see you if you don't move. The first time I saw the bear was about 6 months after I started working nights. Late September, the kind of cold night where the air feels dry and sharp in your lungs. I was riding with Kevin Derby that evening. We just finished checking a stalled vehicle along Highway 89 near Gardner, and we're heading back toward the Tower Roosevelt station. About 2 miles before the junction, the radio crackled. "Tower unit, possible animal disturbance at Bear Creek Campground," the dispatcher began. "Campers reporting a large animal knocking over food lockers." Kevin reached over and turned the radio volume down a little. "That'll be a bear," he began. "Happens every week." We turned off the highway and drove north along a narrow campground access road. The headlights swept across empty picnic tables, metal food lockers, and a few parked RVs with their lights turned off. Bear Creek Campground is small compared to most places in Yellowstone. Maybe 20 campsites, a restroom building, and a gravel loop road that circles through a patch of pine trees. Kevin shut off the truck engine when we reached the center of the loop. "Let's check the lockers first," he said. We stepped out with flashlights. The cold air carried the smell of wet dirt and pine needles. Somewhere deeper in the campground, something metallic clanged. Kevin pointed his light toward the sound. "Probably got in someone's cooler." We walked down the gravel road toward a row of food lockers near a picnic table. One of the metal doors was hanging open, and trash bags were scattered across the ground. Kevin crouched beside the mess and inspected the claw marks on the locker door. "Big one," he said. And that's when I heard breathing. Slow and heavy. I turned my flashlight toward the road behind us. A bear stood about 30 yards away. At first, nothing about it seemed too unusual. It was a large black bear, maybe 6 feet tall when it lifted its head. Its fur looked wet along the shoulders, and its front legs were covered in mud. And then the eyes caught the light. They didn't reflect the beam the way animal eyes usually do. They glowed. Not bright, like a flashlight reflection. The color was dull and steady, like a green light buried deep inside the skull. The bear took a step forward. Kevin saw it the same moment I did. "Don't move," he said. The words snapped something loose in my memory. Kevin had mentioned this exact situation during my first week on the job. At the time, I thought it was a joke. If you see a bear with glowing eyes, stay perfectly still. The bear walked closer. Each step landed with a soft crunch on the gravel road. Its head tilted slightly from side to side, as if it were listening instead of looking. Kevin stood completely still beside the food locker. I forced myself not to shift my weight. The bear stopped about 15 feet away. It lifted its nose and sniffed the air. The smell hit me. Wet fur mixed with something sour, like rotting meat. The bear stepped toward Kevin, and Kevin didn't move. It circled slowly, passing within a few feet of him. The green glow in its eyes stayed fixed on the space in front of him, but its head turned strangely as it walked, almost like it was trying to locate something by sound. And then my boot slid on the gravel. Wasn't a full step, just a tiny shift, and the bear's head snapped toward me instantly. Before I could react, it changed. The animal covered the distance in 2 seconds. Its claws scraped across the road as it lunged straight at the spot where the noise came from. I froze. The bear stopped just inches from me. Its nose hovered a few inches from my chest. Hot breath poured out of its mouth. I could see scars along the side of its muzzle and patches where the fur had fallen away. The glowing eyes stared straight ahead, not at me, at the space where the sound had been. I didn't move. Seconds passed, and then the bear turned its head slightly and sniffed again. Its ears twitched toward the trees at the edge of the campground. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest. The bear spun toward the sound and charged into the darkness. The trees shook for a moment as it crashed through the underbrush. And then everything went quiet again. I let out the breath I'd been holding. Kevin finally moved. "Now you know why the rule exists," he said. I turned toward him, still shaking. "That thing almost killed me." Kevin shook his head. "No, you almost killed yourself." He walked back toward the truck and gestured for me to follow. "That animal can't see the way normal bears do. It hunts by movement and sound." I climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door. Kevin started the engine. "If you move, it finds you," he said. He pulled the truck back onto the campground road and drove slowly toward the highway. "And if you stay still, sometimes it doesn't." He glanced over at me once. "That's rule 1. Rule 2. If you're searching for a missing child, bring green Tic Tacs. The first time I had to use that rule was the following spring. Early May, it's a strange time in Yellowstone. The snow starts melting in the valleys, the rivers run high, and the park begins filling with visitors again. Campgrounds reopen, the roads get busy, and the ranger station phones start ringing every hour with someone asking about weather, wildlife, or trail conditions. Most of those calls happen during the day. The bad ones, they usually come at night. The call came in a little after 9:30 p.m. I was sitting at the desk inside the Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station finishing paperwork from a medical call earlier in the evening when the radio cracked alive. "Tower unit, we've got a missing child at Pine Creek Campground." The dispatcher sounded calm, but the words made the room feel colder. "Age?" Kevin Derby asked from across the road. 7 years old, male, name is Tyler Cooper. Last seen about 20 minutes ago near the restroom building. Kevin stood up immediately. "All right," he said into the radio. Notify park law enforcement and start logging units. We're on our way. He grabbed the truck keys from the hook beside the door and tossed them to me. Let's move. We drove south along US Route 191 with the emergency lights flashing across the trees. Pine Creek Campground sits about 10 minutes from the Tower Roosevelt station, tucked into a narrow patch of forest beside a shallow stream. When we arrived, 2 park law enforcement trucks were already parked near the campground entrance. A small group of campers stood near the restroom building, talking in quiet voices. A woman was crying. Kevin shut off the engine and stepped out of the truck. A ranger from law enforcement walked over. Parents say the kid was playing near their campsite, the ranger said. They looked away for a minute and he was gone. Kevin nodded. Is there a trail nearby? Yeah, the ranger said. Lost Lake Trail starts about a quarter-mile east. Kevin turned to me. Grab the searchlights and your radio. I stepped out of the truck and opened the rear compartment where the gear was stored. That's when Kevin reached into his jacket pocket and held something out to me. A small plastic box. Green Tic Tacs. I stared at it. You're serious? Kevin didn't smile. Take them. I slipped the box into my jacket pocket. Within 10 minutes, the search team had spread out across the campground area. Law enforcement covered the roads and parking lots, while Kevin and I headed toward the trail that ran behind the campsites. Lost Lake Trail begins with a narrow dirt path that winds through a patch of pine trees before climbing up toward the hills. Kevin stopped at the trailhead. All right, you take the trail side, I'll work the ridge. I nodded. We switched on our flashlights, and we moved into the woods. The trail followed the creek for the first 100 yards before splitting into 2 directions. I took the path that stayed close to the water. The beam of my flashlight bounced across rocks, tree trunks, and patches of wet dirt. Tyler, I called out. My voice disappeared into the trees. The only sound that came back was water moving slowly over stones in the creek. I kept walking. About 15 minutes into the search, the trail began narrowing as it curved around a small hill. The ground sloped downward toward the creek, and the trees grew thicker along the bank. I stopped and listened. Something moved above me. Wings. I tilted my flashlight upward. A crow sat on the wooden trail sign about 20 feet ahead of me. The bird watched me. It didn't fly away. I remembered Kevin mentioning the crow once during a conversation about missing persons. The Rangers had a nickname for it. They called it Tic Tac. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket, and I pulled out the small plastic box. The crow tilted its head at me. I opened the lid, and I shook a few of the green Tic Tacs into my hand, and then I crouched down and placed them on a flat rock beside the trail. The crow flew down immediately. It grabbed one of the candies in its beak, hopped back a step, and swallowed it. And then it looked at me. The bird lifted off the rock and flew deeper into the trees. I waited. About 20 feet ahead, it landed on a low branch and turned back toward me. I followed. The crow flew again. Each time it landed, it waited until I caught up before moving again. The bird guided me off the main trail and down a narrow slope that led toward a dry creek bed. The ground there was uneven and covered in fallen branches. And then my flashlight caught something blue. A jacket. I ran forward. A small boy lay on the ground beside a fallen tree trunk. His arms were wrapped around his stomach, and his face was pale under the beam of the flashlight. Tyler, I said. The boy didn't respond. I knelt down and felt his neck. Pulse, weak but steady. His lips were dry and cracked. The ground around him was scattered with pine needles and dirt, like he tried to crawl before collapsing. I grabbed my radio. Tower unit to command. I've located the missing child, alive but unresponsive. The coordinates near the creek bend east of Lost Lake Trail. The radio burst with replies as the other search teams moved toward my location. I looked back toward the trees. The crow was gone. Kevin reached me first with 2 other rangers carrying a stretcher. "Nice work," he said, as we lifted the boy carefully onto it. The boy opened his eyes slightly as we carried him up the slope toward the trail. Later that night, after the boy had been taken to the medical clinic near Gardner, Kevin and I returned to the ranger station. I set the empty Tic Tac box on the desk. "You want to explain that?" I asked. Kevin picked up the box, then turned it over in his hands. "Well, Tic Tac helps us find kids," he said. "Why?" Kevin shrugged. "I have no idea." He set the box back on the desk. "All I know is that the bird likes the green ones." Rule 3. If you see cats in the trees, do not turn your back to them. Back away slowly. I didn't believe that rule either the first time Kevin Derby mentioned it. At the time, it sounded like common sense advice about mountain lions. Yellowstone has plenty of them. And most rangers know the basics. Don't run, make yourself look bigger, maintain eye contact. But Kevin was very specific about one part. Don't turn your back. Not even for a second, he said. The way he said it made it sound less like wildlife advice and more like survival instructions. I learned why a few months later. It was late August, near the end of the busy season, when the park still had tourists, but the nights were starting to cool down. Kevin had the night off that evening, so I was paired with another ranger named Adam Turner. Adam worked days most of the year and only picked up night shifts when the schedule got thin. Around midnight, the radio dispatcher called in a report from a group of hikers who'd returned late from Bear Ridge Trail. They said they heard something moving in the trees above the trail while they were hiking out. They didn't see what it was, but they said branches kept shaking over their heads the whole way down. Adam grabbed the keys to the truck. "It's probably a mountain lion," he said. We drove east along US Route 191 for a few minutes before turning onto the gravel access road that leads toward Bear Ridge Trail. The road runs along a stretch of forest where the trees grow thick and close together, blocking most of the moonlight. Adam parked the truck near the trailhead sign. "You ready?" he asked. I grabbed my flashlight and radio. We stepped onto the trail. Bear Ridge Trail climbs gradually into the hills east of the road. The path starts wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, but after a few hundred yards, it narrows to a single track that winds between tall pine trees. The only sounds were our boots crunching on dirt and the wind moving through the branches above us. About 5 minutes into the hike, Adam stopped. Did you hear that?" I listened. Something moved in the trees, not on the ground. Above us, a branch shifted somewhere to our left, then another branch moved farther ahead. I tilted my flashlight upward. 2 glowing eyes stared back at me from a thick branch about 20 feet above the trail. The shape behind the eyes looked like a mountain lion, and then another pair of eyes appeared on a different branch, and another. 3 cats sat in the trees above the trail, and all of them were watching us. Adam stepped backward. That's weird. Mountain lions don't usually travel in groups." One of the cats shifted its weight and moved along the branch. The movement was smooth and silent. Its body stretched across the limb like it'd been there for hours. Another cat climbed down slightly from its branch and crouched lower. Adam turned his flashlight toward it. "That one's big." The animal was easily larger than any mountain lion I had seen before. The beam of my flashlight moved across the trees. More eyes appeared. 4, then 5. The cats were spread out across the branches above the trail, all facing the same direction. Toward us. Adam took another step backward. I think we should get back to the truck, he said. That's fine, I said, just don't turn around. He looked at me. What? Don't turn your back, I said. Adam shifted his weight again. Why? But before I could answer, one of the cats moved. It didn't jump down. It walked along the branch above us, staying directly over the trail. The others followed. The cats were tracking our movement from above. Okay, Adam began. That's not normal. We started backing down the trail together. Our flashlight stayed pointed upward as we moved. The cats continued pacing along the branches, moving tree to tree above us. One of them dropped lower on the trunk of a pine tree until it was only about 10 feet above the ground. Adam stopped. That thing's following us, he said. Keep backing up, I told him. We moved slowly down the trail for another 30 yards. And then Adam made a mistake. He turned his head slightly and glanced behind him toward the direction of the truck. And one of the cats dropped from the branch instantly. The animal landed on the trail behind us with a heavy thud. Adam spun around. Don't run, I said. The cat crouched low on the dirt path. Its tail flicked slowly behind it. The muscles in its shoulders tightened like it was preparing to jump. Adam froze. The other cats stopped moving in the trees above us, and everything went quiet. I slowly reached for the flashlight mounted on my belt and clicked it on. The second beam of light hit the cat directly in the face. It blinked once, and then it turned and leaped back into the trees. Within seconds, the rest of the cats disappeared into the darkness above the trail. Adam and I stood there for a moment listening. Nothing moved. We backed the rest of the way down the trail and reached the truck without saying another word. Adam didn't speak until we were halfway back to the ranger station. How many were there? I counted 5, I said. He stared out the window at the dark forest passing by. Mountain lions, they don't hunt like that. No, they don't, I said. When we reached the station, Kevin was sitting at the desk finishing paperwork from another call. He looked up as we walked in. You guys run into something? He asked. Adam nodded slowly. Cats, he said. Rule 4. If you hear dead relatives over the radio, turn the radio off and don't look outside for the rest of the night. The first time that rule mattered, I was alone at the Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station. Kevin had taken a day off, and Adam Turner was working a different district that night. That left me covering the radio desk and the truck bay until morning. Nights like that happen a few times every season, when schedules overlap or somebody calls out sick. The station sits just off US Route 191, north of the Lamar Valley area. After midnight, there's almost no traffic on that stretch of road. Occasionally a car passes, heading toward Gardner, but most nights the only vehicles moving through that part of the park belong to rangers or park maintenance crews. That night, a storm had moved through earlier in the evening. By the time midnight came around, the snow had stopped, but a thin layer still covered the ground outside the station. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the trucks parked beside the garage. Inside the building, everything was quiet. I sat at the radio desk finishing a report from a minor vehicle accident that had happened earlier along Highway 89. The heater hummed softly in the corner of the room. The radio stayed silent for nearly an hour, and then it clicked. First I assumed it was just static, Radios in the park pick up strange interference sometimes, especially during bad weather. The speaker crackled once and then went quiet again. I kept writing. A few seconds later, the speaker clicked again. "Jason?" The voice was clear. It came through the radio speaker like a normal transmission. I froze. Jason, you there?" The voice belonged to my brother, Mark Miller. He died in a car accident 4 years before I ever started working in Yellowstone. For a moment, I just stared at the radio. "Jason?" the voice said again. The transmission sounded slightly distorted, like someone speaking through a weak signal. "I'm outside," the voice continued. "Can you open the door?" My eyes moved toward the front window of the station. Snow covered the ground outside the building. The porch light illuminated the wooden steps leading up to the entrance. The trees behind the station swayed slightly in the wind. No one stood on the porch. The radio clicked again. "Jason, I'm freezing out here." The voice sounded exactly like him. Same tone, same rhythm in the way he spoke. For a moment, my chair scraped against the floor as I started to stand. And then something Kevin Derby had said months earlier surfaced in my head. If you hear a dead relative over the radio, turn it off and don't look outside. The radio crackled again. "Jason, I know you can hear me." My hand moved toward the radio controls. The voice sounded closer this time, almost impatient. "Just open the door." I shut the radio off. The room fell silent instantly. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and then I heard footsteps outside. They moved slowly across the wooden porch. The sound traveled along the front wall of the station toward the window beside the desk. I kept my eyes on the paperwork in front of me. Another step. Something stopped just outside the glass. I could feel a presence on the other side of the window without looking up. The porch light still cast shadows across the snow outside, but I refused to turn my head. The footsteps moved again. They circled the building slowly. Snow crunched beneath heavy weight as whatever was outside walked past the window, along the wall, and around the back of the ranger station. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes. The heater continued humming beside the desk. Outside, the footsteps moved around the building again. The sound passed the window a second time, then a third. Eventually, the noises stopped. I didn't move from the chair until the sky outside the window began turning gray with the early morning light. When the sun rose above the tree line, I finally stood and walked toward the door. I opened it slowly, and cold air rushed inside. The snow around the ranger station was covered in tracks. Large footprints circled the entire building. Each print was deep enough to show the shape clearly. They were human, but they were far too large to belong to any person. The track stopped directly in front of the door, right where the voice had said it was standing. Rule 5. If you see a staircase in the woods, burn it. I didn't see the staircase until my second year working nights in Yellowstone. By then, I'd already dealt with the bear, the cats, and the radio incident. Those things had taught me that Kevin Derby's rules existed for a reason. I still didn't understand them all, but I'd stopped arguing about them. The staircase showed up during a missing hiker search. The call came in just after 11 p.m. A man named Daniel Foster had failed to return from a solo hike along Lost Lake Trail. His truck was still parked at the trailhead, and his campsite at Pine Creek Campground was empty. Several teams had already been working the area for several hours when Kevin and I arrived. 2 law enforcement rangers were checking the lower part of the trail while a volunteer team worked the ridge above the creek. Kevin decided we would search the stretch of forest that runs between the trail and an old fire road farther east. We parked the truck near the trailhead, and we grabbed our gear. "Stick close," Kevin said as we stepped into the trees. The forest around Lost Lake Trail is dense even during the day. At night, the branches block most of the moonlight, leaving only narrow beams from our flashlights cutting through the dark. We followed a faint path running parallel to the main trail. The ground was soft with pine needles and patches of wet soil. Somewhere nearby, water moved slowly through the creek. For the first 20 minutes, we didn't find anything. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign the missing hiker had passed through the area. Kevin stopped near a cluster of large rocks. "Let's cut east," he began. "That fire road should be about 100 yards that way." We turned off the faint path and started moving through thicker trees. Fallen branches snapped under our boots as we pushed deeper into the forest. And then my flashlight hit something that didn't belong there. Wood. Straight lines. I stopped walking. Kevin?" He turned and followed the beam of my flashlight. A staircase stood in the middle of the woods. It was made of dark wood, maybe 10 steps tall, with narrow railings on both sides. The structure looked old but intact, like it'd been part of a house or a cabin at some point. Except there was no house, no walls, no foundation. Just a staircase rising out of the dirt. Kevin walked closer and shined his flashlight along the steps. The wood looked dry and weathered, but the edges were clean. No rot, no broken boards. "How does that even get here?" I asked. Kevin didn't answer. He walked around the staircase slowly, inspecting the ground near the base. There were no tracks, no tire marks, no debris from a collapsed building. Nothing. "Don't touch it," Kevin said. I stepped back. He reached into his radio pouch and switched channels. "Command, this is Tower Unit," he began. "We're shifting the search east of Lost Lake Trail. Possible structure located in the woods." The dispatcher acknowledged the message. Kevin clipped the radio back onto his jacket and looked at the staircase again. "We're burning it." I blinked. "What?" Kevin pointed toward the truck. "Gas cans in the back compartment." "You're serious?" "Yes." I jogged back toward the direction of the trail until the beam of the truck's headlights appeared through the trees. The gas can sat exactly where Kevin said it would be, beside the spare batteries and rope bags. I carried it back through the forest. Kevin was still standing near the staircase when I returned. He took the gas can and began pouring fuel across the wooden steps. The liquid soaked into the boards and dripped onto the dirt below. "Any idea what this is?" I asked. Kevin shook his head. "All I know is that we don't leave him standing." He handed the can back to me. "Step away." I moved several yards back through the trees. Kevin pulled a lighter from his pocket and flicked it open. For a moment, the flame illuminated the staircase clearly, and then he dropped the lighter onto the fuel-soaked wood. The fire spread instantly. Orange flames climbed the steps and wrapped around the railings. The dry wood cracked loudly as the heat intensified. I heard something move in the forest behind us then. A branch snapped, then another. Kevin didn't turn toward the sound. "Stay focused," he said. The staircase burned hotter as the flames climbed higher. Smoke drifted upward through the branches overhead. Something heavy moved through the trees again, closer this time. I turned my flashlight toward the noise. The beam caught nothing but trunks and leaves. The fire consumed the steps one by one. Boards collapsed inward as the structure weakened. And eventually the entire staircase fell apart. The last pieces burned down to glowing embers scattered across the ground. The forest went quiet again. Kevin kicked dirt across the remaining flames until only smoke remained. We stood there for a moment listening. Nothing moved in the trees. Kevin finally turned toward the direction of the trail. "All right, let's get back to the search." Well, we found Daniel Foster about an hour later, sitting beside the creek a half-mile away. He'd twisted his ankle and couldn't walk back to the trail on his own. As we helped him onto the stretcher, I glanced once toward the dark forest where the staircase had stood. Nothing was there anymore. Just trees and dirt. Rule 6. If you take a picture and there's a person in it you don't remember seeing, burn the photo. Things can come alive through photos. The photo incident happened last fall. By that point, I'd been working nights out of the Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station for almost 3 years. I'd seen enough strange things in the park to stop questioning Kevin's rules. I didn't always understand them, but I followed him. The call that night started like a normal search. A couple reported hearing someone yelling near Bear Ridge Trail just after sunset. They said the voice sounded like it was coming from deeper in the woods, somewhere off the trail. When they tried to follow the sound, it stopped. Kevin and I drove out to the trailhead along US Route 191 and parked the trail near the entrance sign. "Probably someone just messing around in the trees," Kevin said. We grabbed our radios and flashlights and started walking the trail. Bear Ridge Trail runs through a narrow stretch of forest before climbing toward a rocky overlook that faces the valley. The lower section of the trail stays mostly flat and winds through thick pine trees. About 10 minutes into the search, Kevin stopped. "Take some photos," he said. "For what?" "For the report," he replied. "We document this area whenever we check a location like this." I pulled my phone out and turned on the camera. The flash lit up the trees ahead of us. I took a photo of the trail marker, then another of the surrounding woods. Kevin walked a few yards ahead and scanned the ground with his flashlight, while I took 2 more pictures showing the direction of the trail and the nearby trees. We didn't find anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had actually been yelling in that area. Kevin shrugged. "Probably someone down in the valley," he said. We walked back to the truck and drove to the next area the dispatcher wanted us to check. By the time we returned to the ranger station, it was close to 2 in the morning. Kevin went to the break room to grab coffee, while I sat down at the desk to start writing the incident report. Part of that process involved uploading any photos taken during the search. I opened the camera roll on my phone. The first photo showed the trail marker exactly the way I remembered it. The second photo showed the trees beside the trail. But the third photo made me pause. Someone stood in the background. The figure was partially hidden behind a pine tree, about 20 feet behind Kevin. I leaned closer to the screen. The man wore dark clothing and stood completely still. His face looked pale. I knew immediately that he had not been there when I took the photo. I would have seen him. Kevin walked back into the room carrying his coffee mug. "You finished the report yet?" "Look at this," I said. He stepped beside the desk and looked down at the phone. For a moment, he didn't say anything. And then he set the mug down slowly. "Scroll," he said. I swiped to the next photo. The same trail appeared on the screen, the same trees, the same spot behind Kevin. The man was closer now. He stood fully in the open now, facing the camera. Kevin grabbed the phone from my hand then. "Stop," he said. He walked to the printer beside the desk and connected the phone with a cable. Within seconds, the printer spit out the photo onto a sheet of paper. Kevin carried the printout outside behind the ranger station, where an old metal burn barrel sat beside the maintenance shed. He dropped the photo inside and struck a match. The paper curled as the flames spread across the image. For a moment, the man's face burned orange in the firelight, and then the photo turned to ash. Kevin watched the barrel for a few seconds before walking back toward the station. When I checked my phone again, the photo was gone. The camera roll jumped from the second picture straight to the fifth. The man had disappeared. Kevin picked up his coffee mug and sat back down at the desk. "Sometimes things notice you through pictures." And that was all Kevin told me. Now, most people think the dangerous part of Yellowstone happens during the day. They think about grizzly bears on hiking trails, tourists getting too close to bison, or someone slipping near one of the hot springs. The Park Service posts warning signs everywhere about those things. Rangers give safety talks. Visitors read pamphlets before heading out onto the trails. Those dangers are real. But night is different. When the sun drops behind the mountains, most of the park shuts down. Campground lights turn off. Visitor centers close. The roads empty out except for the occasional car heading toward Gardner or deeper into Yellowstone National Park. And that's when the night shift starts. The Tower Roosevelt Ranger Station stays open 24 hours a day, even when everything else goes quiet. Someone always monitors the radio. Someone always keeps a truck ready to roll if a call comes in. Sometimes those calls are normal. A driver hits a deer on Highway 89 and needs help getting off the road. A camper twists an ankle on Lost Lake Trail and can't walk back to the parking lot. A group of hikers misreads a map and ends up on the wrong trail after sunset. We handle those situations the way any search and rescue team would. We grab our gear, follow the trail, and bring back people safely. But the night rangers also deal with the other things. The things Kevin Derby warned me about during my night shift. Over the years, I've learned that those rules don't exist because someone thought they sounded interesting. Every one of them started with an incident report somewhere in the park's history. A ranger who moved when the bear got close. A search team that ignored the crow. Someone who ran when the cats came down from the trees. Someone who opened the door when the dead voice called from outside. Someone who climbed the staircase. Someone who kept the photograph. The details of those reports don't always make it into the official reports. Sometimes the paperwork just says a ranger went missing during a search or failed to return from patrol. But the people who work nights in Yellowstone, we know the rest of the story. Kevin Derby still runs the night shift most weeks. I've seen him give the same talk to new rangers that he gave me years ago. He sits across the table in the break room with a cup of coffee and explains the rules one at a time. Most of them laugh the first time they hear it. I did. And then they work a few night shifts in the park. And eventually something happens. Maybe they hear a voice on the radio that shouldn't be there. Maybe they notice something moving in the trees above a trail. Maybe they find a staircase where no building has ever stood. After that, they stop laughing. Yellowstone. It's one of the largest national parks in the U.S. Millions of visitors drive through it every year. They take photos, hike the trails, and watch wildlife in the valleys during the day. Most of them leave before the park gets
My name is Daniel Brooks, and I work construction in Northern California. That's the easiest way to describe it to people. If somebody asks what I do, that's what I say.
Construction. Most people picture putting houses up, maybe a crew pouring concrete somewhere outside Sacramento, or building shopping centers off the highway. What I actually do, it's a little different. Most of my work involves digging holes, post holes, foundation holes, utility trenches, equipment pads, sometimes access roads cut into hillsides that haven't seen a vehicle in 50 years. If somebody wants to put something in ground where there isn't already a road, a power line, or a flat piece of dirt, guys like us are usually the ones they call. We work all over Northern California, but most of our contracts come out of one region. People call it the Emerald Triangle. That's the stretch of country where Humboldt, Trinity, and Mendocino counties all meet. If you've ever seen pictures of endless green hills covered in pine trees and fog rolling in off the Pacific, there's a good chance they were taken somewhere in that triangle. It's beautiful country. It's also the kind of place where a lot of things happen that nobody talks about too loudly. If you ask people what the most dangerous thing in the Emerald Triangle is, most of them will give you the same answer. Drugs, illegal grow operations, armed landowners, cartel crews hiding out in the forest, booby-trapped properties, people going missing after they wander too far down the wrong logging road. And some of that is true. I have seen grow sites hidden so deep in the woods that the only way to reach them is by walking an hour uphill through brush. I have seen diesel tanks buried under tarps and irrigation pipes running miles through the trees. Once, we came across a clearing where someone had strung fishing line between trees at neck height to stop trespassers. You learn pretty quickly to mind your business out there. But the drug stories are only part of the reason people disappear in that part of the state. The rest of the time, it's the land itself. The Emerald Triangle, it's full of old mines, collapsed wells, unstable slopes, and logging roads that turn into mud traps after one night of rain. Whole hillsides slide out from under you if you cut the wrong place. Creeks change direction every winter. A truck can vanish down a washed-out ravine and nobody will find it for weeks. We've pulled equipment out of places that look like they'd been abandoned since the 1950s. Rust-colored bulldozers half buried in dirt. Collapsed timber frames from mining operations nobody remembers. Old drilling rigs tipped sideways under blackberry vines. When you work construction in country like that, you get used to strange ground. My crew usually runs 4 men. Kevin Turner is the foreman. He's been doing this kind of work longer than I've been alive. Kevin doesn't talk much unless he needs to, but when he does, we all listen. He's the kind of guy who can walk across a hillside, kick a patch of dirt with his boot, and tell you whether you're about to hit clay, shale, or bedrock 3 feet down. Then there's Brian Foster, who runs the excavator most of the time. Brian is built like the machine he operates. Slow-moving, steady, and nearly impossible to knock off balance. I have seen him thread a 30-foot boom through a stand of trees without scraping bark off a single trunk. The youngest guy in the crew is Ethan Reed. Ethan handles grade stakes, shovels, fuel cans, and whatever else needs doing. He's strong, quick to learn, and just reckless enough that Kevin spends half his time yelling at him to slow down. And then there's me. I run equipment when Brian's off the seat, do ground checks, measure cuts, and keep the job moving. I've worked construction long enough that none of it feels new anymore. Dirt is dirt, right? Machines are machines. And if you follow the right procedures, most problems can be fixed with a shovel and enough patience. At least that's what I believed when I first took this job. The company we work for takes contracts most construction outfits won't touch. Remote telecom towers, private water systems, utility trenches for survey stations miles from the nearest highway. The kind of jobs where you haul equipment up dirt roads so narrow you can see the drop through the driver's side window the whole way up. Those contracts pay, well, a lot better than normal construction work. And the reason, it's simple, nobody wants them. The locations are remote, The ground is unpredictable, and if something goes wrong, it can take hours for help to reach you. But that's not the real reason experienced crews avoid certain jobs. The real reason is something Kevin told me my first week on the crew. We were parked on the side of a logging road in Trinity County, waiting for a survey team to finish marking a cut line. The fog was thick enough that you couldn't see more than 30 yards into the trees. Kevin was leaning against the truck, drinking coffee out of a metal thermos. He watched the surveyors for a while, then said something that didn't make much sense at the time. "Some ground shouldn't be opened unless everyone knows the rules." I remember asking him what rules he meant. He just shrugged and said, "The ones nobody writes down." I figured he was talking about normal safety procedures, watching for gas pockets, checking for unstable slopes, the usual things you worry about when you're digging into unknown terrain. It took a while before I realized that wasn't what he meant at all, because out in the Emerald Triangle, there are places where the ground has been sealed for reasons nobody explains. And if you break into one of those places without knowing the rules first, well, someone on your crew usually dies. Those rules are the only reason I am still alive today. Rule 1. If the dirt turns gray, stop the machine immediately. The first rule Kevin Turner ever taught me didn't sound strange when I heard it. It sounded like normal construction advice. "Watch the color of the dirt," he told me. "If it turns gray, stop the machine immediately." That's not unusual in excavation work. Soil color changes all the time, depending on what layer you hit. You might start with dark brown topsoil, then drop into red clay, then gravel lenses, then shale or fractured rock. Anyone who's dug foundations long enough can read soil like a book. But Kevin wasn't talking about normal layers. He meant a very specific kind of gray. Not ash gray, not dusty clay, not weathered shale. The gray looked wrong. The first time I saw it was on a job in Trinity County, about an hour north of a town so small it didn't even have a gas station anymore. Our contract was simple on paper. Widen a clearing on a hilltop so a telecom company could install a small relay tower. The survey team had already marked the perimeter with orange stakes and spray paint. Our job was to cut the slope back about 20 feet and level a pad big enough for a concrete foundation. Routine work. Brian Foster had the excavator running while I walked the grade line with a measuring rod. Ethan Reed was hauling fuel cans up from the truck. Kevin stood off to the side, watching the cut like he always did. The hillside was mostly red clay mixed with loose shale. Every scoop of the bucket peeled back another layer of it, dumping the spoil into a growing pile downhill from the pad. After about 40 minutes of digging, Brian's bucket bit into something that looked different. First I didn't notice it. Then Kevin shouted, "Stop the machine!" Brian lifted the bucket halfway through its swing and froze. Kevin walked over to the cut and pointed. "You see that?" The exposed wall of soil had changed color about 3 feet down. Everything above it was the usual red clay. Everything below it was gray. But not natural gray. Looked packed, dense, almost powdery, like cement that had been ground back into dirt. Brian leaned out of the cab window. "Just another layer," he said. Kevin shook his head. "That's not a layer." He turned toward the machine. "Back the bucket out." Brian shrugged and started easing the boom away from the cut. He didn't quite make it in time. The tip of the bucket caught the gray layer and punched through it with a dull cracking sound. For a second, nothing happened. And then something inside the hill exploded outward. A spray of thick yellow-gray liquid blasted through the hole Brian had made, hissing as it hit open air. Wasn't water. Wasn't mud. It looked more like a pressurized slurry. Hot, chemical-smelling.
and moving fast enough to splatter across the ground 10 feet away. 2 workers from a subcontract crew were standing closest to the cut. They never had time to move. The spray hit the first man across the face and neck, and he screamed immediately. The second man caught the worst of it across both arms and his chest. He staggered backward, dropping his shovel as the liquid soaked into his shirt. The smell hit us half a second later. Kevin started yelling, "Water! Get the rinse tank!" Brian jumped down from the excavator while Ethan ran for the emergency wash container we kept on the truck. I grabbed the first man by the shoulders and I pulled him away from the cut. His skin was already turning red, not like a sunburn, like something was eating through it. He clawed at his face, screaming that it was burning his eyes. The second man collapsed onto his knees, holding his arms out in front of him, like he didn't recognize them anymore. The slurry kept pouring out of the hole in the hillside for another few seconds before the pressure inside whatever chamber we'd broken into finally died down. By then the ground around the cut was smoking. Ethan came running back with a rinse tank and we started dumping water over the 2 men as fast as we could. And it didn't help much. Where the liquid had touched bare skin, it left raw patches that kept spreading even after we rinsed them. Their clothes were soaked through, and the fabric seemed to trap the chemical against their bodies. Kevin ordered us to drag them farther uphill away from the spill. We laid them down in the dirt, while Brian called for an ambulance on the radio. The man who had taken the spray across his face, he kept trying to open his eyes, but they wouldn't stay open. The other one had stopped yelling and was breathing in short, shallow bursts. I remember Kevin standing over the hole in the hillside, staring at it like he just confirmed something he already suspected. The gray dirt had cracked open into a cavity about the size of a small barrel. Inside it was a thick pool of the same yellow-gray liquid we'd seen spray out. Looked like it'd been sealed there for years, maybe decades. The walls of the chamber were smooth, almost like someone had shaped them intentionally before packing the gray material around it. Kevin swore under his breath. When the ambulance finally arrived, the 2 men were still alive, but they didn't stay that way for long. Both of them died later that night. The official report, they said they'd been exposed to some kind of corrosive chemical compound trapped underground. The investigation blamed an old industrial dumping site that'd been buried before the land changed ownership. That explanation sounded good enough for the county inspectors, but Kevin knew better. A week after the accident, we were finishing cleanup on the site when we walked over and kicked at the gray dirt near the broken chamber. "You remember what I told you about that color?" he asked. I nodded. "Stop the machine," I said. "That's right." He scraped his boot across the powdery soil. "This stuff, it's not natural ground. Somebody packed it in here, sealed that cavity so nothing could get out and nothing could get in." I looked down at the hole where the chamber had been. "You think that was some kind of trap?" Kevin didn't answer right away. He just stared at the hillside for a few seconds, and then he said something that stuck with me. "Ground like this gets sealed for a reason." He turned back toward the truck. "And next time we see gray dirt, we stop before we break through." That was the first rule I learned working construction in the Emerald Triangle. And after what happened to those 2 men, I never questioned it again. Rule 2. If you uncover stacked stones, do not move them. The second rule Kevin Turner taught the crew had nothing to do with machines or soil layers. It had to do with rocks. At first glance, that sounded even less serious than the gray dirt warning. Construction crews uncover rocks constantly. Some are natural, some are left over from old structures. Some are debris pushed into the ground decades earlier and forgotten.
But Kevin wasn't talking about random rocks. He meant stacked stones. Not piles, not scatter, not a collapsed wall. Actual stacks. Flat stones placed carefully on top of each other in narrow columns, sometimes waist high, sometimes only 3 or 4 pieces tall. They show up buried under soil, where nobody would expect them, usually in places that haven't seen human activity in decades. The first time I saw one was on a job in Humboldt County, about 20 miles inland from the coast. Our crew had been hired to dig a trench for a private water line running up a hillside property. The terrain was steep and covered in pine and redwood, the kind of ground where every shovel full of dirt pulls up roots and loose stone. Brian Foster was cutting the trench with the excavator, while I walked behind him measuring depth and clearing loose debris from the trench floor. Ethan Reed was hauling sections of pipe down the hill from the truck. The trench was only about 4 feet deep when Brian stopped the machine.
"Got something here," he said.
I stepped down into the trench and brushed dirt away from the exposed shape. At first I thought it was just a cluster of shale, and then the pattern became clear. 3 flat stones stacked neatly on top of each other, each one about the size of a dinner plate. They were balanced so evenly that the edges lined up almost perfectly. There was no mortar, no concrete, no binding material at all. Just rock on rock. But the placement was too precise to be natural. Ethan jumped down into the trench beside me and crouched to look at it.
"Looks like somebody built a little tower," he said.
He reached down and grabbed the top stone. Kevin's voice came from above us.
"Leave that alone."
Ethan froze. Kevin was standing at the edge of the trench, looking down, with a hard expression I hadn't seen before.
"That's not debris," he said. "That's a marker."
Ethan straightened up slowly and set the stone back where it'd been.
"What kind of marker?" he asked.
Kevin climbed down into the trench and crouched beside the stack. He studied it for a few seconds, then ran a gloved finger across the edges.
"They show up sometimes when we dig in this part of the state," he began. "Always stacked like this. Always buried shallow."
I looked around the trench. "You think somebody put it here?" Kevin nodded once.
"Yes."
Ethan glanced uphill toward the tree line. "Who?" Kevin didn't answer that question. Instead, he stood up and pointed farther along the trench line.
"Dig around it. Leave the stack where it is."
Brian eased the excavator bucket forward again, carefully scooping dirt from both sides of the stones while leaving the stack intact. Within a few minutes, the trench continued past it, and the stones remained standing in the center of the cut, like a small monument. We finished the day's work without touching it. By evening, the fog had rolled down through the trees and the forest had gone quiet. Our crew stayed overnight in a small trailer we hauled up for remote jobs just like this. The machines were parked beside the trench, with portable floodlights set up around the work area. I stepped outside sometime after dark to grab a tool I'd left near the excavator. The lights illuminated the trench, clearly enough that I could see the stacked stones, still standing exactly where we'd left them. Something moved near them. First I thought it was a raccoon, and then it stood up. The figure was short, maybe 3 feet tall. Its body was thick and covered in dirt, the same color as the soil we'd been digging all day. The floodlights reflected off 2 small black eyes that looked more like polished beads than anything human. Another figure climbed up from the trench wall beside it. Then another. They moved quickly but carefully, using the trench walls like ladders. Their arms were thick and strong, and their hands were built for gripping rock and dirt. One of them crouched beside the stacked stones and began adjusting them. It lifted the top piece and set it down again with careful precision, aligning the edges until the column stood perfectly straight. The others watched. None of them made a sound. I stood completely still beside the excavator, and I watched them work. Up close, they looked even stranger than I first thought. Their skin was coated with layers of soil and mud, and scrapes of cloth or leather hung loosely around their shoulders and waist, like makeshift clothing. Their faces were broad and flat. Their noses were small. Their eyes were completely black. After a few seconds, the one adjusting the stones finished its work. It stood up and turned its head in my direction. And for a moment, we simply stared at each other across the trench. Then it reached into the dirt beside the stack and picked something up. The creature walked across the trench floor and set the object down near the excavator track before climbing back up the far wall. And within seconds, the rest of them followed. They disappeared into the darkness of the forest as quietly as they'd arrived. I walked over to the spot where the first one had left the object. It was a small bundle. A handful of thin roots tied tightly together with a strip of fiber. Threaded through the center of the bundle was a narrow white bone. Kevin came out of the trailer a minute later when he saw the floodlights shifting. He walked down to the trench and looked at the bundle in my hand. "They fixed the stack," I said. Kevin nodded slowly. "Good." I held up the bundle of roots and bone. They left this." Kevin took it from my hand and examined it under the floodlight. "That means we were warned." "Warned about what?" I asked. Kevin looked toward the dark tree line where the small figures had disappeared. "Something worse underground." He handed the bundle back to me and climbed out of the trench. "Pack up your tools," he began. "We finish this job tomorrow and we move on." The next morning, the stacked stones were still standing exactly where we'd left them. None of us touched them. And that was the day I learned the second rule. If you uncover stacked stones in the Emerald Triangle, you leave them exactly where they are. Because if the things that build them decide to fix your mistake, it means you were lucky. Rule 3. If you find drawings underground, bag them. The third rule exists because the things living underground are not animals. They're organized. And if you work long enough digging holes in the Emerald Triangle, you will eventually see them. The first time I saw one was on a job in Mendocino County. Our crew had been hired to dig a foundation trench for a small groundwater monitoring station on a ridge about 15 miles inland from the coast. It was the kind of project that usually took 2 days. Dig the trench, set the forms, pour concrete, and move on. The clearing was small and surrounded by pine and scrub oak. The contractor's survey stakes were already in the ground, marking a straight 30-foot trench where the foundation footing would go. Brian Foster had the excavator running up by late morning. The soil there was a mix of clay and fractured rock. Nothing unusual. The bucket cut through it in steady layers, while I checked depth with a measuring rod, and Kevin Turner walked the perimeter, making sure we stayed inside the survey line. About halfway through the trench, Brian's bucket peeled back a section of rock that looked hollow behind it. He eased the boom forward again, and the trench wall collapsed inward. Behind the rock was a tunnel. Not a natural one. The interior walls were smooth and worn down in places, as if something had been moving through it for a long time. The floor sloped slightly downward, disappearing into darkness about 15 feet back. Kevin climbed down into the trench and shined a flashlight inside. "Hold the machine," he said. I stepped beside him and looked into the opening. Bones were scattered along the floor. Animal bones mostly. Deer, raccoon, smaller things. Mixed in with them were objects that had clearly come from the surface. a rusted shovel blade, an old flashlight, a broken plastic toolbox, and farther back along the wall, there were drawings scratched directly into the rock. At first they looked like crude lines, and then the pattern became clear. They were maps. Not just random shapes either. They showed roads running through towns along the coast, intersections, bridges, power stations, water reservoirs. Some of the drawings even showed clusters of houses laid out in neat blocks. Under those maps were other shapes, figures drawn beneath a line that represented the ground. The figures had long bodies, thick tails, and narrow heads. They looked exactly like reptiles. Kevin moved the flashlight deeper into the tunnel. Something shifted inside. The beam caught it for a second before it pulled back into the darkness. And that was the moment I saw it clearly. The thing standing inside the tunnel, it was about the size of a man. Its skin was pale gray-green and covered in small scales that caught the light like dull stone. Its arms were long and thin, ending in hands with narrow clawed fingers that looked perfect for digging through packed soil. Its face was flat and narrow. Two dark eyes reflected the beam of Kevin's flashlight. There was no mistaking what it looked like. A lizard person. The creature stood there watching us from inside the tunnel, and then it turned and slipped deeper into the passage, moving sideways through a narrow crack in the rock, like it'd done it 1,000 times before. Neither Kevin nor I spoke for a few seconds. Finally, Kevin lowered the flashlight. "Now you know what the drawings are for." We spent the next few minutes gathering the loose papers and copying what we could from the walls. Some of the maps were printed county surveys that had been stolen from somewhere on the surface. Others were hand-drawn plans showing tunnels branching outward under hillsides and roads. Several of them had arrows pointing toward larger towns along the coast. Under those arrows were dozens of the same reptile figures rising up from below. That afternoon, we saw 2 more of them near the trench. One appeared along the far edge of the clearing just before sunset. It stood upright among the trees, watching the machines, its tail hanging low behind it like a counterweight. When Brian swung the excavator in its direction, the creature slipped back into the brush and disappeared. The second one appeared after dark. I stepped outside the trailer to check the fuel tank on the generator, and I saw it standing halfway down the trench, studying the maps still scratched into the rock wall. It looked up at me. Its mouth opened slightly, showing a row of narrow teeth, and then it climbed straight up the trench wall and vanished into the forest. The next morning, Kevin told me the third rule. "If you find drawings underground, you bag 'em." "Why?" I asked. "Because those things are planning something." Later that day, we drove into town and stopped at the county sheriff's office. Kevin spread several of the maps across the front desk. The deputy leaned over him and frowned. "The hell's this?" he asked. Kevin pointed to the drawings of tunnels under a small coastal town. "We found them underground at a construction site." The deputy looked at the reptile figures drawn beneath the streets. Then he laughed. "Hey, a kid draw these?" Another officer glanced over his shoulder. "Looks like somebody's fantasy art," he added. Kevin waited a moment, then gathered the papers back into the bag. Outside the station, he handed them to me. "That's the response I expected," he said. We shrugged, and then we drove back to the ridge and went back to work. But the third rule stayed with me after that, because those drawings were not imagination. They were plans, and the lizard people living under the Emerald Triangle have been preparing those plans for a long time. Rule 4. If the gnomes leave you a gift, leave the site before dark. The fourth rule only exists because the gnomes see things before we do. They live underground. They move through cracks in soil, the way raccoons move through brush. They know the tunnels better than any human ever could. And when they decide to warn you about something, you pay attention. The job where I learned that rule was in Humboldt County, about 30 miles inland from the coast. Our crew had been hired to cut a wide equipment pad into the side of a hill so a private company could install a small communications tower. The clearing was surrounded by tall redwoods and steep slopes of loose dirt and rock, the kind of place where heavy equipment has to move slowly, because one bad swing of the boom could send half the hillside sliding downward. Brian Foster had the excavator running by mid-morning. Kevin Turner walked the perimeter, checking the grade stakes, while Ethan Reed and I cleared roots and loose debris from the area where the foundation would go. By late afternoon, the cut was almost finished. And that's when I noticed the head. It was sitting on the steel track of the excavator. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal carcass, maybe a raccoon or a large lizard dragged out of the woods by a predator. And then I got closer. The head wasn't from any animal I recognized. The skin was pale and scaled, the same dull gray-green color as the creature we'd seen inside the tunnel back in Mendocino County. The jaw was narrow and filled with small pointed teeth. The eyes were gone. The neck ended in a rough tear where the body had been ripped away. It was the severed head of a lizard person. Kevin saw it the same moment I did. He walked over slowly, studying the track where the head rested. Then he looked around the clearing.
You didn't put that there, right?
I shook my head.
Neither did I,
Kevin said from behind us. Brian climbed down the excavator cab and stared at it.
What the hell is that thing?
He asked. Kevin didn't answer him. Instead, he crouched down beside the track and examined the ground. Small footprints covered the dirt around the machine. 3-toed prints, about the size of a child's foot. Gnome tracks. Kevin stood up again.
That's a gift,
he said. I looked at him. A gift? He nodded once.
They're warning us.
Warning us about what? Ethan asked. Kevin glanced toward the tree line.
About what's coming.
We finished shutting down the machines immediately. Kevin wanted everyone off the site before sunset. But the job had one problem. The excavator was sitting in a deep cut we'd carved into the hillside. The ramp leading out of the pad had partially collapsed earlier that afternoon when a section of loose soil gave way under the tracks. Brian could still drive the machine out, but it would take time to rebuild the ramp with a dozer blade and bucket. Leaving it overnight was not an option. If the ground shifted again, the excavator could slide down the slope and take half the hillside with it. Kevin cursed under his breath.
Fine, we fix the ramp and we get out.
Brian started the machine again, while Ethan and I hauled rocks and loose dirt into the ramp cut to stabilize it. The sun was already dropping behind the trees. The shadows grew longer across the clearing. And that's when the first lizard person appeared. It climbed out of the trench wall on the far side of the pad. The creature stood upright on 2 legs, its long tail trailing behind it across the dirt. Its scaled skin looked almost black in the fading light. It watched us without moving, and then another one appeared beside it, and another. They came out of the ground through cracks and holes along the edge of the clearing. Some crawled up the trench walls, others slipped between the trees at the edge of the site. There were 6 of them, maybe more. Brian swung the excavator boom toward him. The closest creature hissed and backed away, disappearing behind a pile of loose rock. But the others stayed right where they were.
Move faster,
Kevin said. Ethan and I shoveled dirt into the ramp while Brian worked the bucket back and forth, packing the slope tight enough for the machine to climb. Another lizard person appeared near the generator trailer, and this one moved differently. Instead of standing upright, it crawled low across the ground until it reached the fuel cans beside the trailer. Then it lifted its head and stared directly at Ethan. He froze. "Don't move," Kevin said. The creature tilted its head as if studying him, and then it lunged. Ethan jumped backward just as the lizard person grabbed the edge of the trench wall and tried to pull itself onto the pad. Brian reacted instantly. He swung the excavator bucket down and smashed it into the dirt beside the creature. The impact sent a wave of loose soil cascading into the trench. The lizard person vanished under the falling dirt, and two more appeared along the far edge of the clearing. One of them dragged something across the ground behind it, a length of wire. Another creature crawled out of a narrow hole near the base of a tree. There were more of them now. I could see movement everywhere along the edge of the site. Kevin pointed toward the ramp. "Brian, get the machine out." Brian backed the excavator toward the ramp and started climbing slowly up the slope we'd rebuilt. The ground trembled under the weight of the tracks. As the machine reached the top of the ramp, a small figure darted across the clearing. One of the gnomes. It ran straight to the trench and hurled a fist-sized rock down into one of the openings where the lizard people had appeared. Another gnome followed it, then another. They moved quickly, throwing rocks and chunks of dirt into the holes, collapsing parts of the trench wall. One of the lizard people lunged toward them. The gnomes scattered instantly, vanishing into the forest. Brian finally drove the excavator into solid ground then. Kevin waved the rest of us toward the trucks. "Move!" We didn't argue. Within seconds, the engines were running and the headlights were cutting through the trees as we drove down the narrow dirt road and away from the site. None of us spoke until the clearing disappeared behind us. Kevin was the first one to break the silence. "And that's why, if they leave you a gift, you leave the site before dark." I looked back through the rear window toward the ridge we'd just abandoned. The trees had already swallowed the clearing completely. Somewhere up there, the lizard people were crawling back through the trenches we'd dug. And I wonder if the gnomes were sealing the holes behind them. Rule 5. If the hole breathes warm air, fill it in and leave the dead where they are. The 5th rule is the one nobody likes to talk about. It's the rule that tells you when a job has already gone too far. Kevin didn't explain it until the worst night our crew ever had. The job was in Trinity County, high up along a ridge where the forest opened into patches of exposed rock and loose soil. A contractor had hired us to dig a deep equipment footing for a monitoring station that was supposed to track seismic activity along a nearby fault line. At least that's what the paperwork said. The clearing was small and uneven. Half the work involved cutting back the hillside just to make room for the machines. Brian Foster had the excavator working the slope, while Ethan Reed and I measured the trench lines Kevin Turner had marked earlier that morning. By late afternoon, we had a pit nearly 8 feet deep. The bottom layer was solid rock. Brian switched the excavator to a heavier bucket and started chipping at the stone to widen the footing. And that's when the ground opened. The bucket struck a fracture line, and a section of rock broke away with a loud crack. The piece slid down the pit wall and exposed a dark opening beneath it. At first it looked like another tunnel, but the air coming out of the opening felt different. Warm. Not just slightly warmer than the outside air. Hot. I stepped closer to the pit, and I held my hand near the opening. A steady current of warm air was flowing out of the rock. It smelled like sulfur and wet metal. Kevin climbed down into the pit and shined his flashlight into the opening. The beam revealed smooth black stone inside, not rough like normal rock. It looked melted. Thick iron spikes had been driven into the walls in several places, their surfaces rusted and fused into the stone as if they'd been there for decades. A length of chain hung between two of them, half buried in mineral deposits. Bones were scattered along the floor of the chamber. Some animal bones, some not. Kevin lowered the flashlight slowly. "That's deep ground." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. Kevin looked at him with an expression I had never seen before. "Means this job wasn't about building something." Brian killed the excavator engine. The clearing went quiet, except for the low sound of warm air moving through the hole. I leaned over the edge of the pit and looked down again. The opening inside the rock was widening. Something was pushing against the chamber wall from below. The stone cracked then. A thin black shape slid through the gap. At first it looked like a limb, and then the rest of the body followed. The creature climbing out of the chamber was much taller than any of the lizard people we'd seen before. Its skin was dark red and black, cracked like dried clay. Thin lines of glowing heat ran through the cracks along its arms and chest. Where the warm air touched the surface of the pit, steam rose from its skin. Its arms were long and narrow. Its fingers ended in sharp black points that dug into the rock as it pulled itself upward. And the face was the worst part. It looked almost human at first glance. And then the jaw opened wider than it should have. Inside was a row of jagged teeth, shaped like broken stone. The creature dragged itself halfway out of the chamber, paused, and looked directly at us. Movement exploded then around the clearing. Two lizard people appeared along the edge of the pit. They'd been watching from the trench lines we dug earlier. The moment they saw the thing climbing from the chamber, both of them froze. For a second, none of the creatures moved. And then the lizard people turned and ran. They vanished into the forest without hesitation. Kevin climbed out of the pit immediately. "Everyone back," he said. "What is that thing?" Ethan asked. Kevin didn't take his eyes off the hole. "Something that should have stayed buried." The creature inside the pit pulled itself higher. Its claws scraped across the rock as it climbed toward the surface. Kevin turned toward Brian. "Start the machine." Brian didn't move. "There's still equipment down there," he said. Kevin shook his head. "We're not retrieving anything." The creature's head rose above the edge of the pit. Steam rolled off its body where the cool air hit it. Kevin pointed at the excavator. "Collapse the hole." The creature lifted one arm out of the pit. The claws dug into the soil beside the opening. Brian finally started the excavator. The engine roared to life. He swung the boom over the pit and dropped the bucket into the loose soil beside the opening. A massive load of dirt and rock slid down into the chamber, crashing onto the creature below. But it didn't stop climbing. The thing pushed through the falling dirt, its claws ripping through the soil as if it weighed nothing. "More!" Kevin shouted. Brian filled the bucket again and dumped more dirt into the hole. This time a section of the pit wall collapsed with it. Half the trench slid downward, burying the opening under tons of dirt and broken rock. This time, the creature vanished beneath the collapse. For a few seconds, the ground trembled. and then everything went still. Warm air continued to seep through the loose soil where the pit had been, but nothing else moved. Kevin watched the ground for a long moment, and then he spoke. "If the hole breathes warm air, you fill it in and you leave the dead where they are." None of us argued. We packed the pit with every load of dirt the excavator could move until the hole was completely buried. By the time we finished, the clearing looked like a landslide had taken half the hillside. We shut down the machines, and we left the site before sunset. No one spoke on the drive down the ridge. The official report later said that the ground had collapsed into an unstable fault pocket. Equipment loss. End of investigation. Kevin told me later that the fifth rule always applies the moment warm air starts coming out of the ground. Once that happens, you collapse the hole and you seal it back up. No exceptions. Because if a pit like that is breathing, it means the ground has opened into something deeper. And if someone's still down there when that happens, they're not getting out. They're already too close to whatever lives on the other side of that rock. So you fill the hole, and you leave the dead where they are. We never went back to that site. A different crew came in a few weeks later with smaller equipment and a new contract number. From what I heard, they filled the rest of the pit with gravel and poured a concrete cap over the entire area before installing the monitoring station on top of it. The official explanation was simple. Unstable ground, seismic fault pocket, construction hazard. That's the kind of language reports always use when something strange happens on a job site. It sounds technical enough that nobody asks questions. Our crew didn't argue with the report. We signed the paperwork, packed the equipment, and moved on to the next contract like nothing had happened. That's how these things usually go. If you work construction long enough in the Emerald Triangle, you'll hear stories about people disappearing. Some vanish while hiking. Some vanish after wandering onto private land. Some simply drive down the wrong road and never come back. Most people blame drugs, crime, or the wilderness. Those explanations make sense to anyone who's never spent time digging into the ground out there. But the truth is a little different. Under the hills of Northern California, there's an entire world most people never see. Tunnels running beneath ridges and forest. Stone chambers sealed decades ago. Traps packed with chemicals that kill. Creatures that move through the dirt as easily as we walk across pavement. The lizard people are real. I've seen them standing in trench lines watching our machines. I've seen their maps scratched into rock walls showing roads and towns they plan to reach someday. The gnomes are real too. They're small and strange, but they're not our enemies. Most of the time, they're the only reason crews like ours get any warning at all when something bad starts moving underground. And deeper than both of them are things that should never reach the surface. Things the ground was sealed to hold back. The companies that hire excavation crews in that part of the state, I think they know about it. They won't say it directly, but some of those contracts exist for one reason: to check the ground. Most workers never realize what they're actually doing. They just see a good paycheck and a remote job site. The ones who figure it out are usually the ones who last, because the rules matter. People think the Emerald Triangle is dangerous because of the things that grow above the ground. That's not the whole story. Sure, some men disappear because of criminals. Some disappear because the forest is big and unforgiving. But a lot of them disappear because of what lives under the soil. Crews like ours, they lose more workers than anyone will ever admit in public records. The holes get filled, the paperwork gets filed, and the truth stays buried with everything else. My name is Daniel Griffin. I work as a detective for the Tampa Police Department. Most of my days start the same way. I park behind the North District station just before my shift, kill the engine, and sit there for a minute looking at the row of patrol cars lined up along the curb. The building is a flat concrete structure with narrow windows and a faded blue sign over the entrance. There's always a couple officers standing outside talking before their shift starts. Someone's usually finishing a cigarette near the metal railing by the door. Inside, the place smells like stale coffee and printer toner. The hallway floors are scuffed from years of boots and rolling chairs. Someone always leaves paperwork stacked on the front desk. A patrol officer might be arguing with the dispatcher over a call log. A detective down the hall is usually talking on the phone with a tired voice, explaining something for the third time to someone who doesn't want to hear it. Most of the work we do is normal police work. Domestic calls, missing persons, robberies, drug arrests, bar fights that spill out onto sidewalks after midnight, cars dumped behind warehouses near the interstate. The kind of problems that come with a big city sitting next to the water. Most things that scare people have a name, an address, and a report number. And that's the way I like it. You show up, you look at the scene, you talk to the people involved, and you figure out what happened. Sometimes it takes hours, sometimes it takes weeks, but there's always something real you can grab onto. A footprint, a witness, a camera angle, something you can put into a report and send upstairs. I've been doing the job long enough to know the city pretty well. I know the streets that stay busy late into the night and the ones that empty out after midnight. I know which apartment complexes generate the most calls and which neighborhoods go quiet after 10 o'clock. I know the docks along the bay where fishermen gather at night, and the blocks where nightclub security has to drag someone outside every weekend. Tampa has plenty of real danger. You don't have to go looking for strange things to find trouble here. But every once in a while, something happens that doesn't fit into a report very well. And when that happens, the only thing that keeps you from making a bad decision is staying calm long enough to think. That's something my grandfather taught me. His name was Frank Griffin. He was a cop for most of his life. He worked patrol for decades in Florida before he finally retired. By the time I was old enough to remember much about it, he'd already stepped away from the job, but the habits never really left him. He woke up early every morning, drank coffee out of the same chipped Best Cop coffee mug, listened to the radio while he read the newspaper at the kitchen table. He kept his old service revolver locked in a small metal box on the top shelf of his closet. He showed it to me exactly once when I was a teenager, and then locked it away again. Said it wasn't something you carried unless you absolutely had to. Most of the stories he told me about police work, well, they were short and practical. He didn't talk about bravery or heroics. He talked about mistakes. The guy who rushed into a house without waiting for backup. The officer who fired when he shouldn't have. The man who panicked when something unexpected happened and ended up making everything worse. Whenever the conversation drifted in that direction, my grandfather would lean back in his chair and tap 2 fingers against the table, like he was thinking. And then he'd say the same thing he always said. Now when things get bad, close your eyes and just breathe. That was it. No speech, no big lesson, just that one sentence. He said panic makes people stupid. Your brain starts racing ahead of the situation. Your hands move before your mind catches up. That's when people make a kind of mistake that they can't take back. So his rule is simple. When things start going wrong, stop for a second. Close your eyes and just breathe. He told me that when I was a kid learning to drive. He told me that when I got into my first fist fight in high school. He told me again the day I graduated from a police academy and pinned on my badge. At the time, I thought it was just something old cops said. A habit. A line he liked repeating. It sounded too simple to matter very much. But years later,
standing in a building near the Hillsborough River with doors opening in places they shouldn't and rooms that didn't make sense. That rule was the only thing that kept me from losing control of the situation completely. It was the only thing that kept me alive. Before that night happened, though, there were two other cases that made me realize Tampa had things in it that didn't belong in any report. And the first one happened at the water. Case 1. Davis Islands. The call came in a little after 2 in the morning. My partner that night was Kevin Brooks, a patrol officer who'd been on the job about 6 years. His first instinct was usually the same as mine. Assume there is a simple explanation and work from there. Dispatch said a man had gone into the water near the Davis Islands seawall. The caller was a fisherman who said he saw the man go over the edge of the dock. He sounded shaken, but not hysterical. Calls like that happen more often than people think. Someone slips on wet boards, someone leans too far over the edge, someone drinks too much and loses their balance. We headed across the small bridge towards Davis Islands with the windows cracked open. The air smelled like salt water and engine fuel drifting from the marina. The road was mostly empty except for a couple cars parked near the shoreline. When we pulled into the gravel lot beside the dock, a man was standing near the end of the seawall waving his arms. He was wearing rubber boots and a thick fishing jacket with reflective tape along the sleeves. His tackle bag sat on the ground beside him. Kevin stepped out of the cruiser first. "Yeah, you the one that called?" The man nodded quickly. "Yeah," he began. My name's Ryan Foster. I was fishing out here when the guy went into the water." Ryan pointed down the dock. The wooden walkway stretched about 30 feet over the channel before opening into a small square platform at the end. A ladder dipped down into the water from the far side. "What happened exactly?" I asked. Ryan rubbed both hands across the top of his head, like he was trying to steady himself. "Well, there was a guy standing out there. I didn't know him. He wasn't fishing, just standing near the edge," he said. Ryan glanced back toward the platform again. I heard him yell, and then I saw him go over." "Did he jump?" Kevin asked. Ryan shook his head. No, I don't think so. It happened too fast." Kevin and I walked out onto the dock while Ryan stayed back near the cruiser. The boards creaked slightly under our boots as we moved toward the end. A tackle box sat open halfway down the walkway with plastic lures scattered across the planks. A bait bucket had tipped over nearby, leaking a thin stream of water toward the edge. Near the platform, we found a single running shoe lying on its side. The lace hung over the edge of the dock and dipped into the water. I crouched down and aimed my flashlight across the boards. There were drag marks on the wood. Long streaks where something had scraped toward the ladder. Kevin leaned over the railing and shined his light down between the planks. The water below was black and slow-moving, reflecting a few distant lights from the buildings across the bay. For a moment, nothing happened. And then something hit the underside of the dock. The boards rattled beneath our feet. Kevin stepped back slightly. "You hear that?" he said. I nodded. The ladder at the edge of the platform moved. At first it looked like the water had simply pushed it, and then the metal rails shook again. Kevin raised his gun. I aimed my flashlight directly down the ladder, just as something began moving upward. A hand appeared first. Long fingers wrapped around the metal rail. The skin was gray and slick, stretched tight across narrow knuckles. Another hand gripped the opposite rail. And then a head slowly rose into the beam. It didn't look human. The mouth ran vertically down the center of its face. When it opened slightly, rows of narrow teeth showed in the gap. Water streamed off its shoulders as it lifted itself higher.
The eyes reflected the flashlight beam, shining pale and glassy in the dark. For a moment, it held there on the ladder, just looking at us. And then Kevin fired. The gunshot cracked across the channel and echoed off the buildings along the shoreline. The thing dropped backward instantly, disappearing beneath the surface. The water went still. Neither of us spoke, and then something slammed the dock from underneath. The platform jumped hard enough to shake the railing. A board near the edge split with a loud crack. Kevin stumbled backward and caught himself against the railing. I grabbed his sleeve and pulled him away from the ladder. The water below churned once, sending small waves slapping against the dock supports. And then it settled again. The flashlight beam cut across the surface. Nothing came back up. No head, no hands, no sign of the man Ryan said had been standing there. Just black water sliding slowly through the channel. Kevin lowered his gun slightly. We stood there another minute, just watching the ladder. It didn't move again. Kevin eventually radioed dispatch and requested a dive team. Ryan Foster stayed near the cruiser the entire time, pacing in small circles and glancing toward the dock every few seconds. When we told him divers were coming, he kept repeating that the man had just been standing there 1 second, and gone the next. The search lasted until almost sunrise. Divers went into the channel twice. They never found the body. Later that morning, the report was filed as a probable drowning. There wasn't enough evidence for anything else. Case 2. Club O negative. The missing girl case started early that evening. Her name was Emma Collins, 8 years old, brown hair cut to her shoulders, last seen wearing a yellow t-shirt with a cartoon dolphin on the front, and white sneakers. Her mother reported her missing just before sunset. According to the report, Emma had been outside a convenience store near South Howard Avenue with a woman no one in the family recognized. A security camera showed the woman walking with Emma toward the busier part of the nightlife district. The woman wasn't dragging her. She wasn't forcing her into a car. She just walked beside her, with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. And that made the whole thing worse. When people are taken that quietly, usually means the person doing it already planned everything. By the time I picked up the case, patrol officers had already checked several nearby businesses and pulled whatever camera footage they could find. Most of it showed the same thing: Emma and the woman walking through the area together. The last useful camera angle caught them passing in front of a bar on South Howard. After that, the trail disappeared. I spent the next few hours walking the block, going door to door through the clubs and restaurants along the street. South Howard stays busy at night. Music spills out of open doors, and people move from bar to bar until well past midnight. Most of the employees were cooperative. A few recognized the girl from the still images we'd pulled from the cameras. Nobody knew where she'd gone. Around 11 o'clock, one of the bartenders mentioned something that caught my attention. He said the woman had walked past his place and crossed the street toward another club about half a block down. I followed his finger down the sidewalk. The building he pointed to had a black painted brick exterior and a narrow entrance tucked between two larger bars. Above the doorway hung a red neon sign: Club O negative. Two men in dark suits stood just outside the entrance. They weren't checking IDs or shouting at people like most bouncers on that street. They just stood there with their hands folded in front of them, watching the crowd. Music drifted through the door every time somebody stepped inside. I crossed the street and walked toward them. One of the men opened the door without asking a question. Inside, the lighting was low and red. The room stretched deeper than it looked from the outside. Dark booths lined the walls, and mirrored panels reflected the glow from small lamps hanging above the door.
A slow, heavy rhythm pulsed through the floor from the speakers. What stood out first wasn't the music. It was the quiet. There were plenty of people inside, but nobody was shouting or stumbling around like they do in most clubs. Conversation stayed quiet. People sat close together in the booths. A few stood near the bar holding glasses filled with dark red liquid. Several of the patrons wore sunglasses. Indoors. That wasn't illegal, but it was strange. The bartenders wore black gloves as they worked behind the counter. I moved slowly through the room, scanning faces and looking for the woman from the security footage. Nobody matched the image we'd pulled earlier. But people were watching me, I could feel it. Not openly, just small glances from the corners of booths or reflections in the mirrored wall panels. After about a minute, a woman in a black dress approached me from the side of the room. "Detective Griffin?" she asked calmly. I hadn't shown my badge yet. I looked at her a moment. "Yes," I said. She nodded politely. "Mr. Vallon would like to speak with you." "Who's Mr. Vallon?" I asked. "The owner." She gestured toward a hallway near the back of the club. I followed her past the bar and through a short corridor that led to a closed office door. She knocked once and stepped aside. "Come in," a voice said. The office was smaller than I expected. A wooden desk sat near the center of the room with a single lamp casting a soft yellow light across its surface. Dark curtains covered the windows. Framed black and white photographs hung on the walls. Behind the desk sat a man who looked older than most of the club in the crowd. He stood as I entered. "I'm George Vallon," he said. He was about 5'3", maybe a little shorter. His blonde hair had thinned across the top of his head, leaving the sides brushed neatly back. He wore a dark suit that looked expensive without being flashy. His eyes were a bright, sharp green. They didn't move much. "Detective Griffin," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "Please sit." I stayed standing. "Yeah, I'm looking for a missing girl," I began. 8 years old, brown hair, last seen near this block. George folded his hands together. Yes, I know." That answer caught my attention. "You know," I repeated. George nodded once. "You know, I knew your grandfather." That stopped me for a moment. "Frank Griffin," George continued. "Your grandfather helped me once. A long time ago." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Otherwise, things would have gone badly for you here." George's expression didn't change. "The girl is not here. You are looking in the wrong place." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notepad. With a pen, he wrote 2 street names and slid the paper across the desk. "South Howard and West Azile," he began. "The alley behind the pawn shop." He met my eyes again. "I believe you'll find what you're looking for there." I didn't touch the paper yet. "Why would you tell me that?" I asked. George's lips moved slightly, almost forming a smile. "Because I owe your grandfather." He folded his hands again. I took the paper. The hallway outside felt darker when I stepped back into it. As I walked through the club again, several of the people wearing sunglasses slowly turned their heads to watch me pass. Nobody spoke or tried to stop me. I stepped outside and walked straight to my car. The alley George had written down was only a few blocks away. Behind the pawn shop, the streetlight cast a weak yellow glow across a narrow strip of pavement. A dumpster sat near the wall with broken fence pallets stacked beside it. A chain-link fence ran along the back of the property.
A white van was parked halfway down the alley. The side door was open a few inches. I stepped closer and then I heard it. A small voice crying inside the van. I pulled the door open, and Emma Collins sat on the floor behind a stack of plastic storage bins, hugging her knees. A woman in her 30s was crouched beside her. The woman jerked her head toward me and grabbed a knife from the floor. "Stay back," she said. "I just wanted a child. I just wanted someone to take care of." She lunged forward then. I grabbed her wrist and twisted the knife out of her hand. The blade clattered against the pavement as I pushed her against the side of the van and cuffed her. Emma stayed where she was, crying quietly. And a few minutes later, backup arrived. The woman's name was Lisa Williams. She'd taken Emma earlier that evening, while the girl's mother was inside the convenience store. But now the girl was safe. Case 3. The building near the river. The call about the building came in a few weeks after the Collins case. It was close to 1 a.m. I was at a desk finishing paperwork when dispatch radioed a patrol unit to check an abandoned office building near the Hillsborough River. 2 people in apartments across the street said they heard yelling coming from the inside. First, it sounded like the kind of call patrol clears in 10 minutes. A vacant building draws squatters, drunks, teenagers, copper thieves, all kinds of people who think an empty property means privacy. Usually it ends with somebody being told to leave or getting arrested for trespassing. Then the patrol officer asked for a detective. That got my attention. I drove over the station and crossed into West Tampa with the windows cracked. The streets were mostly empty. A few storefronts still had security lights on. The river sat black beyond the buildings, and every so often a light from the far bank flashed across the windshield. The office building stood by itself on a cracked lot ringed with chain-link fence. Parts of the fence had collapsed inward. Weeds pushed through the asphalt in long, ugly patches. The building inside was 5 stories of stained concrete and dark windows, with sections of glass missing from the upper floors. The front doors were gone. A plywood sign bolted to the fence announced a demolition date that had already been pushed back twice. A patrol cruiser sat near the curb with its headlights washing over the front steps. The officer waiting outside introduced himself as Michael Reed. He was young, maybe 26 or 27, with that look newer cops get when they don't want to admit something bothered them. "So you hear the yelling yourself?" I asked. Reed nodded.
Yeah, from inside. Sounded like one guy at first, then maybe more than one."
"You went in?"
Maybe a foot or 2, he said. Lobby looked empty, and then I heard something move deeper in the building.
He glanced toward the entrance.
I called out and nobody answered. It sounded like somebody ran upstairs.
"You want backup?" I asked. He looked relieved by the question, but he shook his head.
I already asked dispatch to note it. I figured I'd wait for you first.
I looked at the dark opening where the front doors used to be. "You coming in with me?" Reed hesitated, then said,
"You want me to?"
I thought about it for a second and shook my head. No, stay outside. Somebody runs, I want somebody at the car. And if I need more people, I'll call it. That wasn't a typical decision. Normally both of us would go in. But I could tell this kid looked genuinely scared about going inside. I figured I'd step in, be careful, see what was going on, and go from there. He nodded and stepped back toward his cruiser. I switched on my flashlight and walked toward the entrance. My light moved across the lobby and found cubicles, broken desks, a toppled office chair, and strips of hanging ceiling materials. Old papers covered parts of the floor. Filing cabinets stood open and empty against one wall. The place looked dead. I took maybe 6 steps inside and reached for my radio. Dispatch, Detective Griffin. I'm inside the building with Officer Reed outside on perimeter. Nothing came back except a short burst of static. I turned around immediately to go back outside and call for backup from Reed's cruiser. But the opening where the front doors had been was gone. There should have been a rectangular gap showing the patrolled headlights and the lot outside. Instead, there was a solid wall with peeling paint and a water stain running from shoulder height to the floor. I walked over and put my hand on it. Drywall, cold, no frame, no seam, no door.
Reed!
I yelled. My voice carried through the lobby and died in the back of the building. No answer. I yelled again and still nothing. At that point, I stopped treating it like a building clearance and started treating it like an emergency. I drew my pistol, I turned, and I headed for the back of the lobby to look for another exit. A narrow hall ran behind the cubicles toward a stairwell door with frosted safety glass. I reached it in 10 seconds, shoved it open, and went down one flight. Concrete steps, rust on the railings, water stains on the walls. I hit the landing, pushed through the next door, and stepped straight back into the same lobby. Same broken desk and cubicles and paper on the floor. I stared at it for one full second, then turned, went back to the stairwell, and ran up instead. One flight up, two at a time, door at the landing, and I shoved through it hard. And I came out onto that same lobby floor again. And my stomach dropped. I wasn't dealing with a bad floor plan. I wasn't turned around. I wasn't tired. I didn't know what this was, but I was trapped. I moved quickly now, checking every office around the lobby, trying to find a broken window, a service exit, anything. The first two offices were empty except for desks and carpet stains. The third had a row of chairs against the wall and nothing else. The fourth room stopped me cold. It was a conference room. Long table, high-backed office chairs, water rings on the wood, a legal pad near one seat, a glass pitcher sitting on its side near the center. Around the table sat 6 people, 3 men and 3 women. Office clothes, button-down shirts, jackets, slacks. One woman had a silk scarf looped at the neck. One man had his sleeves rolled to his forearms. Their hands rested on the table in front of them, like they were waiting for someone to begin a meeting. But there was a problem. None of them had heads. The necks ended dark and flat above the collars. No blood running, no fresh wounds. Just dry, blackened stumps where heads should have been. One of them still held the pen. I backed out and I shut the door. I didn't investigate, I didn't step closer. I didn't try to rationalize it. I just moved away from that room as fast as I could without running. I headed back for where I thought the stairwell should be. And the wall was different. The frosted glass door was gone. In its place was another office door with peeling beige paint and a brass number plate hanging crooked from one screw. I grabbed the handle, opened it, and found what looked like an old break room. Small tables, a sink, a fridge on its side, vending machines stripped open. Several metal cages lined the far wall, some open, some shut. Something moved under one of the tables. At first I thought it was a stray dog, and then it stepped into the light. It had the body of a medium-sized dog and the head of a tabby cat. Its whiskers twitched. It looked directly at me with wide yellow eyes. Another thing trotted behind it. That one had the body of a cat and the head of a small dog with pointed ears. It opened its mouth and barked once. The dog-bodied thing rubbed its cat face against a chair leg and started purring. I shut the door hard. I stood there in the hallway, listening. At first there was nothing. And then somewhere deeper in the building, a door slammed. And then another and another. I turned and moved fast in the opposite direction. The hall seemed longer than it had been before. Doors that shouldn't have been there lined the walls now. My flashlight beam caught old, crooked, motivational posters, still hanging crooked in places. Teamwork? Integrity? Vision? The paper under the glass had bubbled from moisture and age. I passed one doorway and saw another office inside it. A small office, a single table in the center, with a dollhouse on top. I almost kept going, and then my light passed over it again, and I stopped. The dollhouse was lit from inside by a warm yellow glow. It was detailed enough to show tiny wallpaper, tiny curtains, tiny chairs. A front wall had been cut away, so the rooms inside were fully visible. I stepped closer. There were figures inside. Tiny men and women and children. Every single one of them stood facing the open side of the house. Every single one of them was smiling. And every one of them held a little knife. Written in small black letters above the open front was a single sentence. When Smiley is missing, no one smiles. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I didn't need to see anything else. The figures didn't move while I stood there, but they looked ready to. It felt like if I stayed another 5 seconds, every one of those little arms would lift at once. I backed quickly out of the room, and the hallway outside had changed again. What should have been a straight path back to the lobby now bent left into darkness. A ceiling tile fell somewhere nearby and burst on the floor. And then footsteps started above me. Several, fast running. I turned the other direction and found a stairwell door at the end of the hall. I ran to it, shoved it open, and took the steps upward. 1 flight, 2, 3. The air changed as I climbed. It got colder, then warmer, then cold again. On the 4th landing, the walls were damp enough to shine in the flashlight beam. On the 5th, the beam hit open space. I stopped. There should have been another set of stairs and another ceiling above me. But there was no ceiling. Above the landing was an open black sky filled with stars. Not city sky, not a hole in the roof. This was vast and endless. The stairwell walls simply ended, jagged and broken, and above them stretched a dark universe that did not belong over Tampa, Florida. Something huge moved across it. Then another. At first my brain tried to make them into clouds, then shadows, and then some kind of illusion caused by darkness. They weren't. They were enormous shapes floating slowly through the stars, too large for my eyes to fully take in at once. Long limbs or tendrils hung beneath them. Parts of them pulsed as they moved. One turned, or maybe rolled, and I saw a suggestion of clustered eyes spread across something massive. I don't know how else to describe it. They looked like things that shouldn't fit into the world. One drifted directly over the open top of the stairwell. Something dangled beneath it, reaching down through the stars like roots hanging from the underside of a boat. I backed down a step, then another. The things kept floating overhead. If one of those things had leaned closer even a little, I think I would have emptied my magazine at it out of pure terror, and it would have made no difference at all. I turned and ran this time down the stairs. By the time I hit the lower landing, I was breathing hard. I pushed through the nearest door expecting the lobby, and instead I stepped into another floor entirely.
Long rows of cubicles stretched out in both directions. Some had old family photos still pinned to fabric walls. Some had plastic plants on the desks. Computer monitors sat dusty and cracked in the corners. The place looked like people had stood up in the middle of a workday and just never come back. And then I heard voices, low and close, from somewhere between the cubicles. I moved down the aisle with my gun up and my flashlight in my left hand. The whispering followed me. Sometimes it sounded like it was ahead, sometimes behind me. I rounded a divider and found a water cooler in the center of a small break area. Its blue jug was full. Something hit it from inside. The plastic jumped. A second impact bulged the side of the bottle outward. I kept moving. At the end of the cubicle row, I found another conference room. I didn't want to look in, but the door was already standing open. The headless people were in there again. Same six, same positions, but one change. The chair at the end of the table was no longer empty. A seventh figure sat there now. It wore a suit. Its hands rested on the table. Its neck ended in the same black stump as the others, and on the notepad in front of it, fresh, dark writing, there were 3 words: "Stay for minutes." I didn't read anything else. I turned and got out of there. And that was the moment panic really hit me. I stopped trying to search. I stopped trying to solve the layout. I just wanted out. I ran through 2 more hallways, shoved through a door, and came out in what looked like a records room with shelves bolted to the floor. Cardboard boxes sat collapsed in piles. One box near the doorway had children's toys inside it. Plastic blocks, a stuffed bear, a doll with no eyes. I backed away from that room and nearly fell when another door slammed somewhere behind me. And then the building woke up completely. It started with a sound of laughter. More than one person, maybe 10 or 20. Men, women, children, all laughing at once from different parts of the floor. Then footsteps started above me. Then below me. Something dragged along the wall to my right with a slow scraping sound. A cubicle partition near the far end of the room tipped over by itself. Dust shook loose from overhead. The laughter got louder. A scream joined it. Then another. And then a deep animal sound that didn't belong in any building at all. The floor trembled under my boots. I rounded a corner and hit a dead-end wall that should not have been there. I turned back and saw doors all along the hall starting to swing open. Slowly at first, then wider. Dark rooms beyond them. Shapes moving inside some of them. The building shook harder. Ceiling debris fell around me. The laughter was everywhere now, mixed with running footsteps, with crying, with barks, with purring, with a high, thin noise like metal being bent. It was horrifying. And that's when I thought of my grandfather. A memory hitting me at the exact right second. Frank Griffin at his kitchen table, coffee mug in one hand, looking at me over the rim and saying the same thing he'd said my whole life. When things get bad, close your eyes and just breathe. I did exactly that. I holstered my pistol, closed my eyes. I stood still in that hallway while the building shook around me and let the air move slowly in and out of my lungs. The noises got louder at first. It was like the laughter was right behind me, footsteps charging down the hall, the floor vibrating under my feet. And then the building went completely quiet. I opened my eyes. I was standing in the original lobby. The opening where the front doors had been was back. Headlights from Michael Reed's cruiser shone through it across the floor. I didn't wait to see if it would change again. I ran straight out of that building,
down the steps, and into the lot. Reed pushed off his cruiser as soon as he saw me.
You good?
Yeah, I said. That didn't sound like I meant it. How long was I in there? I asked. He shrugged.
A minute? Maybe 2?
I looked back at the building. It had felt like hours. Reed followed my eyes.
You want me to call more units?
I thought about the conference room, the animal heads, the dollhouse, the open stairwell under those impossible stars with those giant things floating overhead. I shook my head. No, I said. Seal it, and keep people out until demolition. Reed frowned, but nodded. Well, a few weeks later, that building did come down. I drove by on the second day of demolition and watched an excavator punch through the upper floors. Concrete collapsed inward. Huge plumes of dust rolled out into the sky. From the street, it looked ordinary. Just an old building. But I knew better. I still work as a detective in Tampa. I still park behind the same station and walk past the same row of patrol cars. The same front desk gets buried under paperwork. The same tired voices carry down the hallway at the end of a long shift. Most of the calls are still the kind you can explain when the sun comes up. A break-in and missing wallet, a drunk guy with a split lip outside a bar, something with a witness, a camera, a report number. That part never changed. What changed was me. I don't go near the Davis Island seawall at night unless I absolutely have to. If a call comes in from that dock after dark, I bring more people than I need and I keep my eyes on that ladder. I don't walk into places like Club O Negative anymore, thinking a badge and a gun make me the most dangerous thing in the room. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes all they do is tell something older and worse exactly who you are. And I don't enter abandoned buildings by the river anymore. Not ever again. The one near the Hillsborough River is gone now. The lot is flat. The rubble was hauled off weeks after demolition, and if you drove past it today, you'd never know what stood there. You'd see dirt, weeds, and a temporary fence. Nothing more. But I know what was inside it. I know what sat around that conference table. I know what moved around in that break room. I know what stared out of that dollhouse. And sometimes, late at night, I still think about that stairwell with no ceiling, that black sky, those things drifting overhead. I never asked my grandfather what he meant the first 100 times he told me to close my eyes and breathe. I thought it was just one of those things old cops say, because they've run out of patience and, just want to sound wise. But you know what I think now? I think that maybe he learned that rule the hard way. Maybe he learned it on a bad call. Maybe he learned it from somebody like George Vallon. Maybe he learned it from standing in front of something he knew he couldn't fight. I'll never know. He's gone now. What I do know is that